Hey there, fellow travellers. Picture this. A Costco parking lot in 2026 with designated spots for horse-drawn buggies, a bank with a hitching post out front, kids zipping around on push scooters because, well, cars are out of the question. Welcome to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where tens of thousands of people have looked at the modern world, with all its smartphones and electric grids and Tesla deliveries, and politely said, no thank you. Tonight we're stepping straight into one of the most fascinating communities in North America. These folks willingly traded Wi-Fi for windmills, Netflix for needlework, and rush hour traffic for the steady clip-clop of hooves on country roads. But here's the part that really gets me. After their teenagers get a taste of the outside world, with full permission to try smartphones, cars, and everything else, nearly 9 out of 10 of them come right back home. So who are these people really? What is the actual difference between the Amish and the Mennonites? And why is their way of life quietly growing while the rest of us are doom-scrolling at 3 in the morning? Before we set off down those quiet country lanes, do me a favour and smash that like button if you're ready for a real deep dive. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I genuinely want to know who is riding along with me tonight. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head into Lancaster together. Let's roll. So let us start where the story actually lives today, on the rolling green farmland of southeastern Pennsylvania, about 80 miles west of Philadelphia and a million miles, culturally speaking, from anywhere else in the country. Lancaster County is the kind of place where a satellite map looks like a patchwork quilt your grandmother might have stitched. All neat squares of corn, tobacco, alfalfa, and dairy pasture, with white farmhouses set back from the road and silos rising out of the morning fog like quiet sentinels. The land here is unusually generous. Beneath that picture postcard surface sits some of the most fertile soil in North America. Deep limestone-rich earth that drains well, holds nutrients, and forgives a farmer for almost any mistake short of arson. There is a reason early settlers took one look at this valley and decided to unhitch the wagon for good. The Susquehanna River runs along the western edge, the Conestoga winds through the middle, and the climate hits that comfortable middle ground where you get 4 real seasons, but nothing punishing enough to ruin a harvest. In other words, naturally this is exactly the spot where a community that depends entirely on agriculture for its survival would put down roots and refuse to leave. For a long stretch of American history, Lancaster County was simply called the breadbasket of the East, before refrigerated trucks and industrial-scale farming in the Midwest changed the rules. The wheat that fed Philadelphia, the flour that supplied colonial bakeries, the beef and pork that kept General Washington's army marching, much of it came rolling out of these very fields in covered wagons. The county was so productive that during the Revolutionary War, when the British occupied Philadelphia and Congress had to flee for its life, the founders ran straight to Lancaster and held a session of the Continental Congress there for exactly 1 day before continuing on to York. The locals were politely surprised to find the entire federal government suddenly looking for places to sleep, which, given the available accommodations of the era, was not exactly a 5-star situation. But the soil kept producing and producing and producing, and the families that worked it became some of the most successful small farmers in the Western Hemisphere. That title eventually shifted away as Iowa and Illinois unrolled their endless prairies, but the agricultural muscle memory never left Lancaster. It just changed hands. Where mainstream commercial farms got bigger and more mechanized, the plain community held on to the old way. The small family operation worked with horses and hand tools, and somehow, against every prediction made by every economist of the last 100 years, they kept paying their mortgages and feeding their kids. Today the county sits at roughly 550,000 residents, give or take, and somewhere between 40 and 45,000 of them are Amish. That number alone does not sound especially dramatic until you understand what it represents. This is the densest concentration of Old Order Amish anywhere on the planet. Full stop. Add in the various flavors of Mennonites who live alongside them, plus a handful of Brethren, River Brethren, and a few smaller groups whose names sound like obscure folk bands, and you are looking at a plain population somewhere north of 90,000 people in a single county. To put it in perspective, that means roughly 1 in 6 people you might pass on a back road in Lancaster belongs to some branch of the broader plain community. In certain townships, that ratio flips entirely. Drive through Bird in Hand, or Intercourse, or Paradise, and you can spend an entire afternoon without encountering anyone wearing a zipper. The names of these towns, by the way, are real. Intercourse. Pennsylvania has been called Intercourse since 1814, and the historians cannot fully agree why, although the locals have been answering tourists' questions about it with admirable patience for 200 years. The geography itself does something interesting to this community. Lancaster County sits in a sort of cradle, ringed by hills and rivers, with the main corridors of modern American travel running just close enough to keep the economy connected, and just far enough away to keep the daily rhythm intact. Philadelphia is an hour and a half by car, New York is 3, Washington is 2.5. The Amish do not drive themselves, of course, but the tourists do, and so do the wholesalers, and so do the contractors who buy Amish-built sheds, and the brides looking for handmade quilts, and the food companies that source organic dairy from these very pastures. The community gets the benefit of being plugged into the largest consumer market in North America without ever having to leave the county. Money flows in, goods flow out, and the community itself stays largely where it was a century ago. It is a deeply weird economic miracle, the kind of arrangement an outsider would assume could not possibly hold together, and yet it does, every day, with the steady predictability of a horse going to market on the same Tuesday it went last week. What you see when you actually drive through this place is what really sells it. You will be cruising along Route 340, also known as the Old Philadelphia Pike, in a perfectly normal rented sedan, and a buggy will appear in your lane doing about 8 miles an hour, complete with a flashing battery-powered triangle on the back, and a teenage driver in a black hat who is paying you absolutely no mind. 5 minutes later, you pass an outlet mall. 5 minutes after that, an Amish farmer is ploughing a 40-acre field behind a 6-horse hitch, while a tour bus rolls by on the highway snapping photos. The contrast does not bother anyone here. It has been the rhythm of the county for generations. The Plain community has learned, perhaps better than any other group in America, how to live right next to the modern world without being absorbed by it. The land helps, the geography helps, and the sheer numbers, that critical mass of 40,000 neighbours who share the same beliefs, the same dialect, the same dress code, makes it possible to walk out your front door every morning and feel like the 17th century is still going strong, even though a Wawa convenience store is selling hoagies less than a mile down the road. Now, if you want to understand why Lancaster specifically became the heart of Plain culture in North America, the answer goes back about 300 years and involves a Quaker, a king, and a serious real estate deal. In 1681, King Charles II of England owed a substantial debt to the family of a man named William Penn. Penn was a Quaker, which in 17th century England was roughly equivalent to being a member of an extremely uncool religious club that the authorities periodically threw in prison for refusing to swear oaths, attend the official church, or remove their hats in the presence of nobility. Penn had personally done time in the Tower of London for his beliefs, an experience that, unsurprisingly, gave him strong opinions about religious freedom. When the king settled the family debt by handing Penn a massive chunk of land on the western shore of the Atlantic, Penn looked at his new property and decided to try something that had never really been attempted on a serious scale anywhere in the European world. He decided to build a colony where any peaceful religious group could come and worship however they wanted, without anyone showing up at their door with a warrant or a torch. He called it the Holy Experiment. Most of his contemporaries considered it adorable but doomed. Penn personally wrote letters and pamphlets in German, English, Dutch and French, inviting persecuted religious communities across Europe to come settle his new colony. He offered cheap land, no required state church, no military service, and a guarantee that nobody would care what you believed as long as you paid your taxes and did not start fights with the neighbours. For groups like the Mennonites and the Amish, who'd been getting their barns burned and their leaders drowned and their kids taken away for the better part of 150 years across Switzerland, southern Germany and the Netherlands, this was the most generous offer they had heard in living memory. The first significant wave of Mennonites arrived in Germantown just outside Philadelphia in 1683. Within a few decades, family after family began moving west, away from the growing port city, looking for farmland. They found it in Lancaster. The Amish, who as we will see in a moment had only recently broken off from the Mennonites, arrived in larger numbers starting around 1737, and they too pushed inland, settling along the Pekea Creek and the surrounding fertile bottomlands. By the time of the American Revolution, the Plain community had already been farming Lancaster for 2 or 3 generations. They have not stopped since. This is the root of the geographic miracle. Lancaster did not become the capital of Plain America because of some later decision or convenient accident. It was the very first major Plain settlement, the original landing spot, the place where the Mennonites and Amish first learned what it felt like to plough a field without looking over their shoulder. Every other Plain community in North America, the ones in Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa, Ontario, even the brand new settlements in Montana and Maine, trace their roots back here. When a Lancaster family gets too crowded and decides to move, they do not move to start a new culture. They take Lancaster with them, which is why a buggy in northern Indiana still looks fundamentally like a buggy in Pennsylvania, even though the two communities have not lived in the same county for 150 years. Demographically, the community is in a stage that any sociologist will tell you is statistically remarkable. The Amish population in North America doubles roughly every 20 years. There were about 5,000 Amish on the entire continent in 1900. By 1950, there were around 30,000. By 2000, nearly 200,000. Today the number sits around 400,000, with projections suggesting it will pass 1 million sometime in the late 2050s. Lancaster is the largest single settlement, but it is no longer the majority. Ohio has overtaken it in raw numbers, and Indiana is hot on Ohio's heels. The reason for this explosive growth is not migration, since almost nobody converts in from the outside. It is simple arithmetic. The average Amish family has between 6 and 8 children, the retention rate hovers around 85%, infant mortality is low, and the community discourages all the modern habits that drive birth rates down everywhere else. The math runs in one direction only. Naturally, this presents a small problem for a community that depends on farmland, since farmland does not double itself every 20 years, which is exactly why younger Amish families have been buying property in places like upstate New York, southern Virginia, and even Maine, where land is cheaper and the regulations on small-scale dairy operations are friendlier. But the heart of it all, the cultural memory, the dialect, the songbooks, the buggy designs, still beats hardest in Lancaster. Walk through the county on a Sunday morning and you will see something almost no other community in America can show you. Half the population is in church, but you would not know it from looking at the buildings, because the Amish do not have church buildings. They worship in private homes, rotating from farm to farm every 2 weeks. The other half is doing exactly what their great-grandparents did on the same day in 1925, which is sitting on a porch visiting with cousins, or walking down to the next farm for Sunday dinner. The Mennonites do have church buildings, modest white-painted structures with simple steeples and no stained glass, and their parking lots fill up with both buggies and cars depending on which branch of Mennonite you're looking at. The roads themselves slow down on Sundays. There is something almost physically tangible about the way the county exhales on the 7th day. Even the tourists pick up on it, although most of them only realize it later, after they have gone home and noticed that something in the air was different from any Sunday they had ever experienced before. The local economy mirrors all of this in ways that surprise people who expect to find a poor, isolated community. The plain population of Lancaster is on average doing fine. Some families are wealthy by any measure. Amish-owned construction firms build sheds, gazebos, and entire prefabricated houses that get shipped across the eastern seaboard. Amish furniture makers turn out solid wood pieces that retail for thousands of dollars in city showrooms. Amish dairies sell organic milk to companies that have entire marketing departments dedicated to telling you how wholesome their product is. There are Amish-run welding shops, Amish quilt cooperatives, Amish bakeries that supply restaurants in Philadelphia, and Amish greenhouses that fill garden centers across 3 states every spring. The community is not opting out of capitalism. It is opting out of a specific lifestyle that capitalism tends to push, the lifestyle of constant individual mobility and constant individual consumption. They are still very good at making money. They are just unusually disciplined about what they spend it on. The tourism layer on top of all this is its own peculiar phenomenon. Lancaster County draws roughly 11 million visitors a year, which is more than Yellowstone National Park, and almost all of those visitors are here for one reason. They want to see the Amish. The community has a deeply complicated relationship with this, as you might imagine. On one hand, the tourists buy the quilts, the pretzels, the whoopie pies, the hand-carved birdhouses, and the buggy rides at the heritage farms. They keep entire towns economically afloat. On the other hand, the tourists also stop their cars in the middle of country roads to take photos of Amish children walking home from school, knock on farmhouse doors looking for souvenirs, and ask deeply personal questions about religion in the middle of the produce aisle at the local market. The Amish response to all of this has been, on the whole, astonishingly patient. They politely decline to be photographed, they sell what they have to sell, and they go about their day. There is a quiet acceptance that the tourists are part of the landscape now, like the weather, and there is no point in resenting the weather. You just dress for it. There is also a strong sense, when you actually spend time on these back roads, that the land itself sets the daily pace. In a county where the dominant mode of transport tops out at about 10 miles per hour, distances feel different than they do in the rest of America. A trip to the next town is an event, not an errand. A visit to cousins 20 miles away is something you plan for, not something you squeeze in between Zoom calls. This compression of distance does something quietly powerful to the social fabric. Families stay close because travelling far is expensive in time, which is, of course, exactly the point. When the bishops settled on the buggy as the permanent ceiling for personal transportation, they were not making a sentimental choice. They were drawing a circle around the community, the size of one day's round trip by horse, and saying, "This is where your life will happen." The geography of Lancaster, with its compact townships and dense farm grid, makes that circle exactly the right size. Everything you need is inside it. Almost nothing requires you to step outside it. The land cooperates with the rule. You can also see the influence of the community in subtler details that most tourists never notice. The roads themselves are wider than you might expect for such an old county, partly because they were laid out in an era when farm wagons needed room to pass, and partly because the modern transportation department has, over the years, added paved shoulders specifically to keep buggies safe from passing trucks. Bridges are reinforced for the weight of milk trucks that visit the small dairies every morning. Many of the back lanes have those little flashing yellow lights, warning drivers about horse traffic, lights that nowhere else in America really needs. The county government, the state troopers, the school districts, all of them have spent decades quietly learning how to coexist with a population that does not vote in large numbers, does not lobby for anything, and asks for very little, but absolutely must be accommodated for the whole system to function. It is one of the more remarkable pieces of civic engineering you will find in the United States, and almost nobody outside the county notices it exists. And so, this is the place. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a piece of land that has been growing food for 300 years, that holds the deepest roots of plain America, that lives a daily double life as both a working farm community and the most visited cultural destination in the mid-Atlantic, and that is currently producing children faster than it can buy land for them. Everything else we will talk about in this story, the buggies, the bonnets, the bishops, the dialect, the schoolhouses, the long slow Sundays, and the surprisingly modern businesses, all of it grows out of this particular soil, which is why we started here. To understand the plain community, you have to first understand the field they planted themselves in, but the field is only half the story. To really get what is happening on these farms in 2026, you have to walk back almost exactly 500 years to a moment in Central Europe when a handful of unusually stubborn people decided that the official church of their day had gotten one critical detail very, very wrong. That detail was infant baptism, which is going to sound like a strange hill to die on, but for these particular believers it was the whole hill, and many of them did in fact die on it. The story begins in Zurich, Switzerland, in January of 1525. Europe at this moment was a continent in the middle of a religious earthquake. 8 years earlier, a German monk named Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, kicking off what would become the Protestant Reformation. Luther's basic argument was that the Roman Catholic Church had drifted away from the Bible and needed serious reform, and his ideas spread through Europe with the speed of a viral video, helped along by the recently invented printing press. By the mid-1520s, Switzerland had its own reformer, a man named Huldrych Zwingli, who was leading Zurich away from Rome and toward a stripped-down, scripture-focused Protestantism. Zwingli was popular, well-connected, and politically savvy. He had the support of the Zurich City Council. He was, in short, the establishment version of religious change. But Zwingli had a problem. A group of his own younger students had read the Bible carefully and concluded that he was not going far enough. Their argument was simple. Nowhere in the New Testament does it actually describe baptizing infants. Every baptism mentioned in Scripture, they pointed out, involves an adult who has heard the message and made a conscious decision to follow Christ. If that was how the first Christians did it, they said, then that was how it should be done now. The whole apparatus of state-sponsored religion, where every baby got dunked at birth and was automatically a member of the official church for life, was, in their reading, a man-made tradition with no scriptural basis. They wanted to start over. They wanted a church of adults who chose, freely and personally, to be baptized. They were, in modern terms, asking some uncomfortable questions about a system that had been running smoothly for over 1,000 years. Zwingli refused to go that far. The Zurich Council backed him up. On January 18, 1525, the city issued an order. Either the dissidents would baptize their infants and shut up about it, or they would face exile. 3 days later, on the evening of January 21st, a small group of these radicals gathered in a private home in Zurich. Among them were Konrad Grebel, a former classmate of Zwingli's, Felix Manz, a young scholar, and George Blaurock, a former priest. According to the account that survived, Blaurock asked Grebel to baptize him. Grebel poured water over his head. Blaurock then turned and baptized the others. With that small ceremony in a Zurich living room, the Anabaptist movement was born. The name, given by their enemies, means rebaptizers, because in the eyes of the official church these adults had already been baptized as infants, and getting baptized a second time was technically a crime, in fact, punishable by death. The authorities did not take long to respond. Within a few years, anti-Anabaptist laws were spreading across Switzerland, Germany, and Austria. The reasoning behind the harsh punishment was not purely religious, although that was certainly part of it. In 16th century Europe, church and state were tangled together so tightly that you could not really pull on one without unravelling the other. To reject infant baptism was to reject the idea that every citizen was automatically a member of the state church, which meant rejecting the entire system by which the state kept track of, taxed, and controlled its population. Anabaptists also tended to refuse military service, refused to swear oaths, and refused to participate in civil government, all of which made them look, to the average ruling prince, like a clear and present threat to public order. The response was brutal. Anabaptists were imprisoned, banished, and in many cases executed. Drowning was a common method, chosen with grim irony, since the authorities reasoned that people who liked water baptism so much could have all the water they wanted. Burning at the stake was also frequent. Within a few years, the leaders of that original Zurich meeting were dead. Manz was drowned in the Limmat River in 1527. Blaurock was burned at the stake in 1529. Grebel had died of the plague in 1526, which under the circumstances probably qualified as a soft landing. But the movement, instead of dying, scattered. Anabaptists fled across borders, deeper into the Alps, into the Tyrol, into Moravia, into the Netherlands. They held secret meetings in barns and forests. They smuggled handwritten copies of the New Testament between farmhouses, and they kept baptizing each other. Wherever they were found, they were punished. But punishment had a curious effect. It did not silence them. It produced something the movement would carry forward for the next 500 years, a deep, almost genetic conviction that the world outside the community was dangerous, that the state was not to be trusted, and that the only safety lay in keeping the church small, separate, and stubbornly committed to its own rules. This idea of separation from the world, called nonconformity in their language, became the bedrock of everything that followed. It is the reason an Amish family in 2026 still refuses to plug into the electric grid. The reasoning is direct. The grid connects you to the world. The world has historically not had your best interests at heart. In the Netherlands, the movement found its single most important leader. A former Catholic priest named Menno Simons left the church in 1536 after years of doubt and reading and joined the Anabaptists. Menno was a gentle, scholarly man, by the standards of his time, and he spent the next 25 years of his life travelling through the Low Countries and northern Germany, organising scattered groups of believers, writing letters of pastoral encouragement, and shaping the movement into something more disciplined and less chaotic than it had been in its first hectic decade. His followers came to be called Mennonites, and eventually Mennonites, a name they carry to this day. Menno emphasised pacifism, simplicity, and church discipline, including a practice called the ban, or shunning, in which members who refused to repent of serious sin would be cut off from the fellowship of the church. This was not just a vague spiritual idea, it meant the rest of the community would refuse to eat with the offender, do business with them, or in some cases even speak to them until they returned to the church. Shunning would later become a deep point of disagreement, and the source of one of the most consequential splits in the entire history of the movement, but more on that in a minute. One of the most famous stories from this era of persecution involves a man named Dirk Willems. Now, the details of his life have been retold many times over the centuries, and the version that survives in the community memory is the one that matters. Willems was a Dutch Anabaptist in the 1560s, arrested for his beliefs and held in a prison in the town of Asperen. One winter, he managed to escape, climbing down from a window using knotted rags. A guard noticed him and gave chase. Willems crossed a frozen pond, his weight light from months of poor prison rations, and made it safely to the other side. The guard, heavier and less careful, broke through the ice and fell into the freezing water. He cried out for help, and Willems, the man who had every reason in the world to keep running, turned around. He went back across the ice. He pulled the guard out and saved his life. The guard, presumably grateful, would have let him go. But the local bailiff, watching all of this from the shore, ordered the guard to rearrest him under threat of severe punishment. Willems was taken back to prison, and shortly thereafter burned at the stake. The wind that day, the chroniclers note, was blowing the wrong way, so the fire took an unusually long time to do its work. That story is engraved into the collective memory of the Plain community more deeply than almost any other. There is a hymn about it. There are paintings of it. Amish and Mennonite children grow up hearing the story, and the lesson is not really about the fire. The lesson is about the turn on the ice, the choice to go back, the conviction that loving your enemy is not a metaphor or a poetic ideal, but a literal instruction, even when it costs you your life. This is why, when something terrible happens to a Plain community in modern times, the world tends to watch a response that does not look like any response it knows how to make. We will get to that later. For now, just understand that the story of Dirk Willems is not ancient history to these people. It is, in a real sense, last week. For the next century, Mennonite and Anabaptist communities survived in the cracks of European society. They were tolerated in some places, persecuted in others, and constantly on the move. Some found temporary safety in the Netherlands, which gradually became more tolerant. Some moved into the Vistula Delta in what is now Poland, where local nobles welcomed their farming skills and turned a blind eye to their religion. Others stayed in the Swiss highlands and the Alsace region, hidden in remote valleys, paying special taxes for the privilege of being left mostly alone. The community survived, but it was always a fragile survival, and the question of what kind of community they wanted to be and how strict its boundaries should be kept coming up. Which brings us to 1693, and the moment our story actually splits in two. In the Alsace region, a Swiss-born Anabaptist elder named Jacob Amann had been growing increasingly concerned that the Mennonite churches around him had gotten too soft. Specifically, he believed they were not practicing shunning strictly enough. When someone was excommunicated, Amann argued, the entire community should treat them as cut off, including in everyday social and business interactions, until they returned to the faith. He also pushed for more frequent communion services twice a year instead of once, and stricter rules about clothing, beard length, and personal habits. The Mennonite elders, led by a man named Hans Reist, disagreed. They thought Amann was being too rigid. They thought shunning at the table, refusing to eat with a band member, was enough. The argument escalated. Letters flew back and forth. Meetings were held. Tempers, which one suspects had been simmering for some time, finally boiled over. In 1693, Amann and his followers formally separated from the broader Mennonite community. They took the name Amish, from Amann's own surname, and they became the strictest, most disciplined, most carefully separated branch of the Anabaptist family tree. The split was bitter at the time, the kind of family argument that still gets brought up at reunions 3 centuries later. There were attempts at reconciliation. Amann himself, late in life, reportedly tried to walk back some of his harsher positions and reunite with the Mennonites, but by then too much had happened, and the separation became permanent. From that day to this, Mennonites and Amish are the same family, sharing the same ancestors and most of the same beliefs, but living under different rules. Two siblings who grew up in the same house and made different choices about how to live as adults. They still talk to each other. They are still recognizably related. But they are not the same group, and the small differences between them, as we will see, end up shaping daily life in ways that an outsider might never notice but the community feels constantly. By the early 1700s, the Anabaptists of all stripes were exhausted. A century and a half of persecution, displacement, and constant negotiation with hostile authorities had worn the community thin. And then William Penn's letters arrived, the ones we already mentioned, offering land and religious freedom across the ocean. For families who had been hiding in Swiss mountain valleys and Dutch backwaters for generations, the offer was almost too good to believe. They believed it anyway. The first major wave of Mennonites crossed the Atlantic in the 1680s and settled around Germantown. The first significant Amish group arrived in 1737 on a ship called the Charming Nancy, which docked in Philadelphia and unloaded several families that would become founding ancestors of essentially every Amish person alive today. Pull a Lancaster County phone book, if you can still find one, and you will see the same surnames over and over again: Stoltzfus, Lapp, King, Byler, Fisher, Zook, Esch. These are the descendants of those original immigrants, multiplied across 3 centuries. The plain community in America has never had to face the kind of life-or-death persecution their ancestors knew in Europe. There have been hard times, certainly. During the World Wars, conscientious objectors were sometimes treated badly. There were legal fights over school attendance laws, military drafts, and social security participation. But by and large, the deal William Penn promised has held. The plain people farm their land. They are left alone. And the genetic memory of what life was like before that deal, of bishops drowning in rivers and Dirk Willems turning back on the ice, sits quietly underneath everything they do, like a watermark in expensive paper. One book in particular keeps that memory alive. It is called The Martyr's Mirror, originally published in Dutch in 1660, and it sits on a shelf in essentially every Amish and conservative Mennonite home in North America. The book is a massive collection, well over 1,000 pages, documenting the stories of Christian martyrs from the early church, all the way through the Anabaptist persecutions of the 16th and early 17th centuries. There are detailed accounts of trials, of last words spoken before execution, of the names of the prosecutors and the dates of the burnings. It includes engravings, including one of the famous scene of Dirk Willems on the ice, which has been reproduced so often that even people who have never opened the book recognize it instantly. Plain families read sections of The Martyr's Mirror out loud during long winter evenings, the way other families might read novels. Children grow up knowing the stories not as distant legends, but as part of their own family heritage. When a young person stands up at adult baptism in a Lancaster farmhouse in 2026 and promises to be faithful even unto death, those last 4 words are not poetic flourish. Somewhere on the bookshelf in the next room, there is a thick volume filled with the names of people who took the same promise literally. Another quiet but important thread in the community memory is the tradition of non-resistance, which is not quite the same as modern pacifism. The plain people do not just oppose war, they oppose the use of force, including the force of the law, to settle disputes inside the community or against outsiders. This is why, historically, Amish farmers have refused to sue people even when they had clear grounds. It is why an Amish business owner who gets cheated will often simply absorb the loss rather than go to court. The reasoning traces straight back to the New Testament instructions to love your enemies and turn the other cheek, instructions that the Anabaptist founders read as binding commands rather than aspirational ideals. Critics over the years have pointed out fairly that this principle can be exploited by anyone willing to take advantage of it. The community generally answers that the price of being taken advantage of occasionally is much smaller than the price of becoming the kind of people who fight back. It is, in their view, a deal worth making. It is the reason, even now, when a teenager comes home from a year of running wild and decides to join the church, the words spoken at that adult baptism still treat the decision as a serious one. Because for 300 years before this farm existed, getting baptized as an adult could get you killed. The community has not forgotten. They will not forget, and as long as they remember the desire to remain separate from the world, the original engine of their faith will keep running, one generation at a time. Now that we have walked through the soil and the centuries that produced the plain community, it is time to deal with a misconception that almost every outsider brings into Lancaster the first time. The misconception goes something like this. The Amish and the Mennonites are basically the same group, slightly different flavours of the same vanilla ice cream, and within each group everyone lives by the same rules. This sounds reasonable. It is also, unfortunately, completely wrong. The Plain community in North America is not one community. It is dozens, possibly hundreds, depending on how you count. And the differences between them are not cosmetic. They are the entire point. Let me give you a small scene that illustrates the issue. Imagine driving down a country road on a Tuesday afternoon. You pass a farmhouse on the left. The barn is connected to the house. There is no power line running to the roof, and a grey-topped buggy is parked next to a horse trough. Two children in dark clothes are walking back from a one-room schoolhouse. The girls in long dresses and small white head coverings, the boys in plain shirts and suspenders. You think to yourself, the Amish. Then you drive another 2 minutes and pass another farmhouse on the right. The barn is also connected to the house, but this one has a power line, a satellite dish on the corner, and a black pickup truck in the driveway. A woman is hanging laundry on the line, wearing what looks like a similar long dress and a small white head covering, but the dress is patterned cotton and her hair is partially visible. A teenage boy walks out of the house wearing jeans, a plain button-down shirt and ordinary work boots. He climbs into the truck and drives off. You blink. These people, by every visible standard you have been given, also seem to be plain people, but they have a truck, and electricity, and you would later discover smartphones. What is going on? What is going on is the spectrum. The plain community is not a single line drawn between modern and traditional. It is a slow, deliberate gradient that runs from the absolute strictest end of the Old Order Amish, through several intermediate groups, into the various branches of conservative Mennonites, all the way up to what people sometimes call Mennonite Light, communities that are nearly indistinguishable from any other small rural Protestant church, except for a slight preference for plain clothing among the older women. Every single group along this gradient sees itself as occupying the correct middle ground, with the people to their left being too strict and the people to their right being too worldly. The result is a kind of beautifully complicated theological geography, where two families living 100 yards apart can belong to communities with completely different rules, and yet still wave at each other politely every morning, because in the end they all came from the same Swiss mountain valleys. Let us start at the strictest end and work our way out, because that is the only way the gradient really makes sense. At the very far left, if we imagine the spectrum laid out left to right from most traditional to most modern, sit the Swartzentruber Amish. The Swarzentrubers broke off from the main Old Order Amish in the early 1900s, named after a bishop named Samuel Swartzentruber, who led the split, and they have spent the last 120 years specialising in saying no. No indoor plumbing, no bathrooms in the house, no carpets, no upholstered furniture, no curtains beyond the simplest cotton hangings. No SEMV triangles, the orange warning markers that every other buggy in America uses to alert drivers at night. No reflective tape, no battery-powered lights beyond the absolute minimum, no power tools, no pneumatic equipment, no gas-powered washing machines. Their buggies are uncovered or only minimally covered, with hard wooden seats and no springs. Their farms typically use only horse-drawn equipment with steel wheels rather than rubber tyres, because rubber tyres, in their reading, are too close to the comfort of modern vehicles. Visiting a Swartzentruber farmhouse, if you ever got the chance, would be like stepping into a working museum of 1880s rural life, except that the people inside are not historical reenactors. They genuinely live this way every day, and they have done so for 5 generations. The Swarzentrubers tend to be relatively small in number, maybe 20,000 or so across North America, concentrated in pockets of Ohio, New York and Pennsylvania. They do not live in Lancaster proper, although there are a few smaller groups in nearby counties. The Swartzentruber position on the rest of the Amish community is, broadly, that everyone else has drifted. Allowing indoor toilets in their view was the moment the slide began, and they have spent a century watching their cousins prove them right, by gradually adding gas refrigerators, then gas stoves, then propane lights, then battery-powered LED headlamps on the buggies. From a Swartzentruber porch, the standard Old Order Amish look almost suburban. This is not exactly the position one would expect to find a group taking in 2026. But as the Swarzentrubers themselves would point out, calendars do not actually determine what is correct. Move one notch to the right and you encounter the Andy Weaver Amish, sometimes called the Dan Church, another conservative splinter. Then come the various Old Order Amish communities that make up the great bulk of the population. The Lancaster Old Order, which is what most people mean when they say the Amish, sits roughly in the middle of the traditional zone. They have indoor plumbing, gas refrigerators, gas lights or LED-powered lighting, grey-topped buggies with rubber wheels, modern sanitation, and increasingly sophisticated workshop equipment driven by pneumatic or hydraulic power instead of electricity. They will not connect their homes to the public power grid, but they will use a diesel generator to run a freezer in the milk house, because the milk inspector requires it. They will not own cars, but they will hire English drivers, that is non-Amish drivers, to take them on longer trips. They will not have telephones inside the home, but they will share a phone shanty at the end of the lane with the neighbours. The Lancaster Old Order is by any honest measure both deeply traditional and deeply pragmatic, and the way they have negotiated these compromises is itself a centuries-long conversation that we will dig into in a later chapter. Within the Lancaster Old Order alone, there are then sub-distinctions that the community sees clearly even though outsiders never could. The largest is the difference between the so-called Lancaster Amish and the Byler Amish, sometimes called the Yellow Toppers. The Bylers split off in 1849 in what was the first major Amish division in America, over questions about ordination procedures and church discipline. They are smaller than the main Lancaster group, maybe 1,000 or so families, and the most visible marker of their identity is, of all things, the colour of their buggy roof. Lancaster Old Order buggies are grey. Byler buggies are yellow. If you spend any time in the back roads of certain townships, you can identify which church a passing family belongs to by glancing at the roof. There are other markers as well. Byler men wear one suspender instead of two, a tradition so specific that the joke among the community is that you can tell a Byler from behind. The Bylers also have slightly different rules about technology, hair length, and women's head coverings, although the differences are small enough that an outsider would struggle to spot them without being told. Then there is the Nebraska Amish, a smaller conservative group originally from Pennsylvania, who somehow ended up with that geographically misleading name. The Nebraskas use white-topped buggies, no batteries, no inside toilets, and they have a reputation for being among the most conservative communities in Pennsylvania. There are the New Order Amish, which is its own complicated label, since the word new sounds modern, but really refers to a movement from the 1960s that wanted both stricter spiritual discipline and slightly more openness to certain technologies, particularly telephones inside the home and electricity from solar panels. The New Order Amish are, in some ways, more conservative than the Old Order in matters of personal piety, requiring members to abstain from tobacco and emphasizing personal Bible study, while being more permissive in matters of household convenience. This is the kind of contradiction that only makes sense once you understand that for the plain community, the question is never simply modern or traditional. The question is always, does this particular thing strengthen or weaken our separation from the world? Moving further to the right on the spectrum, you cross from Amish into Mennonite territory, although the border itself is fuzzy. The most conservative Mennonites, sometimes called Old Order Mennonites or Horse and Buggy Mennonites, look almost identical to the Amish at first glance. They drive black buggies, they live on family farms, they speak the same Pennsylvania Dutch dialect at home. The biggest difference between them and the Amish, the difference that traces straight back to that 1693 split we already talked about, is in church discipline. Old Order Mennonites do not practice strict shunning. If someone leaves the church, the family still speaks to them. The other practical difference is church buildings. Old Order Mennonites worship in modest meeting houses rather than in private homes the way the Amish do. The buildings are plain white wooden structures with no decorations, no crosses on the outside, no stained glass, and the worshippers sit on backless benches. But the very fact that they have a building, a permanent dedicated space for worship, makes them, in the community's own internal logic, a slightly different kind of group than the Amish, who pack and unpack church benches every 2 weeks for services in someone's living room. Past the Old Order Mennonites, you encounter the Wenger Mennonites, also called Grofdale Conference Mennonites, who drive black buggies but have looser rules about workshop technology, allowing certain electric tools as long as they are not used inside the home. Then the Weaverland Conference Mennonites, sometimes called Black Bumper Mennonites, who drive cars but require the cars to be black, with chrome trim painted over so that nothing on the vehicle is showy. The black bumper rule, which sounds almost like a joke when you first hear it, makes a kind of sense once you understand the underlying logic. The car is permitted because it is a useful tool. The chrome is forbidden because it is decoration. The community is trying to use the tool without absorbing the lifestyle that usually comes with the tool. Whether they have succeeded at this is a question the Amish Mennonites argue about among themselves, but the principle is consistent. A few years ago, a researcher counted the Mennonite groups in Lancaster County alone, and got to over a dozen separate conferences, fellowships, and independent congregations, each with its own slightly different rulebook. There is the Reidenbach Mennonites, sometimes called the 35ers, because they split off in 1946 in a dispute over support for relief efforts during World War II. There is the Stauffer Mennonites, who broke away in 1845 over disagreements about discipline. There is the Hoover Mennonites, the Pikers, the Markham Group, the Reformed Mennonites, and several smaller fellowships whose names you would have to be locally embedded to even recognize. Each one represents a moment when a particular community decided that the church it belonged to had crossed a specific line, and the only honest response was to start a new church on the correct side of that line. To an outsider, this looks like endless fragmentation. To the people involved, each split is the natural result of taking faithfulness seriously. If you genuinely believe that a particular practice is wrong, the argument goes, then continuing to participate in a church that allows it is itself a sin. Better to walk away cleanly than to slowly compromise. Further along still, you find the Beachy Amish, who broke off from the Old Order Amish in 1927 under a bishop named Moses Beachy. The Beaches are an interesting hinge group, neither quite Amish nor quite Mennonite. They allow cars, electricity in the home, and telephones, and they worship in meeting houses. But the men keep the beards and plain clothes that mark Amish identity, and the women keep the small white head coverings. The Beachies are mission-minded in a way the Old Order is not. They send members on volunteer trips abroad. They run schools that go past 8th grade. They support missionary work in places like Haiti and Eastern Europe. They are in many ways the bridge between the strict separation of the Old Order and the more outward-facing Christianity of the moderate Mennonites. Then come the moderate and progressive Mennonites, who occupy a wide and somewhat chaotic stretch of the spectrum. Some still wear modest plain clothing, some do not. Some women wear head coverings, some have stopped. Some communities forbid television. Some have church members who run small media production companies. The progressive Mennonites of certain conferences are essentially indistinguishable, in daily life, from any other socially conservative Christian denomination. They drive whatever cars they want. They use the internet. They attend college. They vote. They serve on local school boards. And the only thing that might tell you they came from the same family tree as the Swartzentrubers is a certain quiet warmth towards simple living and a strong tendency to over-deliver at potluck dinners. This entire gradient, from the Swartzentrubers at one end to the progressive Mennonites at the other, shares a common ancestry, a common holy book, and a common set of theological convictions. Where they differ is on the question of how thick the wall between the church and the surrounding world needs to be. The strict end believes the wall must be very thick and very high. The moderate end believes the wall can have many doors, as long as the people inside remember who they are when they walk through them. The disagreement between them is not new. It is in fact the same disagreement that produced the original split between Jacob Ammann and Hans Reist back in 1693. It just keeps repeating itself, generation after generation, with new technologies playing the role of the original argument about shunning. Here is the part that often surprises outsiders. The different groups along the spectrum do not by and large see themselves as being on a spectrum at all. To a Swartzentruber, the Lancaster Old Order is not slightly more modern. The Lancaster Old Order has fallen. To a Lancaster Old Order Amish, the Beachy Amish are no longer really Amish. To a Beachy, the moderate Mennonites have lost the plain witness. And to a progressive Mennonite, the Swartzentrubers are admirable in their commitment, but mistaken in their reading of Scripture. Each group is convinced that it has found the correct balance, and each is at least mildly worried about the choices the others have made. This is not generally a hostile dynamic. The groups do business with each other. They attend funerals across community lines. Cousins from different branches send each other Christmas cards. But underneath the everyday politeness, everyone knows that the lines drawn in 1693, in 1849, in 1927, in 1966, in 1990 are real lines, and crossing them is a serious matter. What this all means, in practical terms, is that when somebody tells you they visited the Amish, they have actually visited one very specific corner of the Plain community, almost always the Lancaster Old Order, because that is the group with the highest tourist visibility. Everything tourists see at the heritage farms, the buggy rides, the quilt shops, the bakeries selling whoopie pies, is filtered through the conventions of one particular subset. The actual range of Plain life is far wider than what shows up on a postcard. Walk into a Mennonite hardware store in central Pennsylvania, and the cashier may be using an iPad to process your credit card while wearing the same prayer covering her great-grandmother wore in 1925. Walk onto a Schwartzentruber farm in Ohio, and the same prayer covering is in use, but the cashier would be horrified by the iPad. Both women would call themselves plain. Both would be correct. They simply represent different answers to the question of how separate is separate enough. This is also why outsiders who ask why don't the Amish just become Mennonite, since they are basically the same, are missing the whole point. The differences are not arbitrary. They are the result of 3 centuries of careful argument about what faithfulness actually requires, and the people inside those arguments take them very seriously. There is no easy upgrade path from one group to another. To leave the old order Amish and join the Mennonites is, for a Lancaster family, a serious step, sometimes a painful one, and it can carry social costs that last for years. Conversely, joining a stricter group from a more moderate one is also possible but rare. Most people stay where they were born. The spectrum, in other words, is real, but the movement along it is slow and almost always downhill toward greater modernization. The strict end is, by and large, supplied by tradition and birth. The moderate end is supplied, in addition, by people who have decided that a slightly looser version of Plain life is what they want. Now that we have mapped the spectrum, we can finally get to the single most visible symbol of the Plain community, the one thing that every tourist photographs and almost nobody actually understands. The buggy. If you have driven through Lancaster County for even an hour, you have seen one. Probably you have seen dozens. They look quaint. They look picturesque. They look like a charming piece of 19th century life that somebody decided to preserve. They are also, and this is the part nobody tells you, one of the most carefully engineered pieces of social technology in the entire Plain world. The buggy is not a vehicle in the way you would normally think of a vehicle. It is a fence. Let me explain what I mean. A bishop in Lancaster County, when asked some years ago by a researcher why the Amish stick with horse-drawn transportation in an age of cars, gave an answer that has been quoted ever since. He said simply, "The purpose of the buggy is to keep a man from going more than 15 miles from home." That sentence, once you let it sit for a minute, contains everything you need to know about the philosophy. The buggy is not really about preserving tradition. It is not about hating cars. It is about deliberately limiting the size of the world a person can comfortably reach. A horse can pull a buggy at a reasonable trot for maybe 7 or 8 miles before needing rest. A round trip to a place 15 miles away is a full day, including the time at the destination. Beyond that radius, travel becomes inconvenient enough that most people, most of the time, simply do not go. And that radius, the bishop pointed out, contains everything a faithful person actually needs: family, church, farm, market, school, doctor, funeral, wedding. Anything beyond that circle is by definition not part of daily life. The buggy is the tool that draws the circle. This is a radically different way of thinking about transportation than the one most of us grew up with. In modern American life, the car is a tool of freedom. It expands the radius of your daily existence to 50 miles, 100 miles, sometimes more. You can live in one town, work in another, shop in a third, and worship in a fourth. Your life is spread across a geography that would have been completely unimaginable to your great-grandfather. The Amish look at this arrangement and see something different. They see fragmentation. They see a person whose family, friends, employer, church, and neighbours are all in separate places, none of whom know each other, none of whom can hold the person accountable. The car does not, in their view, expand freedom. It expands distance. And distance, the bishops would argue, is what allows a community to come apart. So they kept the buggy. And not because they could not afford something better, which is the assumption most outsiders make when they first encounter a horse-drawn vehicle on a public road. The buggy is, in fact, expensive. A new top-of-the-line Lancaster County buggy, built in one of the dozen or so specialized shops scattered across the county, sells for somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000. Some of the more elaborate family carriages can run higher than that. A used buggy in good condition might go for $6,000 or $7,000. For comparison, that is roughly the price of a serviceable used car. The community is not choosing the cheaper option. They are choosing the slower option and paying a premium for the privilege. If you can manage to get yourself invited into a buggy shop, which is not easy but is occasionally possible, if you know someone who knows someone, you will discover that the modern Amish buggy is not the simple wooden cart you might be picturing. It is, in fact, a quietly sophisticated piece of equipment that has absorbed nearly every useful technology of the last 100 years that the community has been willing to accept. The frame is made of fiberglass or hardwood, depending on the shop. The wheels are steel-rimmed with hard rubber tread, except in Schwarzentroober buggies, which still use plain steel. The interior is upholstered, in Lancaster at least, with proper cushioned seats and lined with fabric that is plain in colour but woven for durability. The roof is fiberglass, painted grey for the Lancaster Old Order, yellow for the Bylers, white for the Nebraskas, black for the Mennonites. The colours, which look arbitrary to an outsider, are essentially heraldry, telling anyone who passes by exactly which church the driver belongs to. The technology inside the modern buggy is the part that really surprises first-time visitors. Most Lancaster buggies now come standard with battery-powered LED headlights, taillights, and turn signals, all of it run off a deep-cycle battery mounted under the seat. There is a flashing, slow-moving vehicle triangle on the back, required by Pennsylvania law for any vehicle that cannot keep up with normal road traffic. Many buggies have propane heaters built into the floor, because Pennsylvania winters are not exactly forgiving when your only insulation is a wool blanket. Some of the higher-end models have hydraulic disc brakes, the same kind of system you would find on a small car, because slowing several hundred pounds of horse and carriage on a wet hill requires more than a simple friction brake. There are buggies with windshield wipers, with interior dome lights, with cup holders. One shop in Lancaster reportedly experimented with cruise control-style speed regulators on the brakes, although that technology did not catch on, mostly because horses are not actually compatible with cruise control. The horses themselves are also more specialised than most outsiders assume. The standard buggy horse in Lancaster is the standard bred, the same breed used in harness racing, often acquired second-hand from the racing industry once they slow down past competitive speed. A retired standard bred at age 7 or 8 is still a strong, fast, even-tempered animal, perfectly suited to pulling a family buggy for another decade or 15 years. Some communities prefer different breeds, the Belgians and Percherons for heavier work, the Morgan for general use, but the standard bred has become the workhorse of the Lancaster Amish buggy world. A good standard bred from a reputable seller runs about $2,000 to $4,000, plus the cost of stabling, feed, harness and farrier service. Owning a buggy and the horse to pull it is, when you add it all up, roughly equivalent to owning a moderately priced car, except the maintenance schedule involves alfalfa rather than oil changes. The relationship between horse and driver in a plain household is a quietly intimate one. Most Amish children start learning to handle a horse before they can read. A boy of 7 or 8 will already know how to hitch a small pony cart, brush down the animal after a long pull, check hooves for stones, and ease the bit into the mouth without bruising the tongue. By 12 or 13, that same child can drive a family buggy on public roads, even managing the tricky moment of pulling out of a driveway into oncoming traffic on a 50-mile-per-hour state route. The horse becomes, in some sense, a member of the family. It is named, fed, and worried over. When a buggy horse dies, especially one that has served the family for 15 or 20 years, children cry. Adults pause for a moment at the barn door before going back to work. There is no equivalent emotional moment, generally, when somebody's Toyota finally gives out. The economics of buggy production are themselves a small window into the plain community. There are perhaps 20 or 30 serious buggy shops in Lancaster County, ranging from small 2-person operations to larger family businesses that employ a dozen workers. Each shop has its own slightly different design conventions, its own preferred suppliers for axles, lights, upholstery and fiberglass roofs. A buggy is essentially built to order, the way a custom kitchen is built. The customer chooses the model, the trim, the lighting package, the seat material. Delivery times can run 3 to 6 months for popular models, especially in the busy spring and fall seasons. Some shops have waiting lists. The whole industry runs on cash, handshakes, and reputation, with very little paperwork beyond a basic invoice. It is, in many ways, a perfect example of how the plain economy actually works at the small business level. Specialized, local, slow, reliable, and almost entirely invisible to anyone who does not happen to live within 15 miles of one of the shops. There are different kinds of buggies, of course, depending on the use. The standard family buggy is the boxy enclosed one most tourists picture, with room for 2 adults in front and a small back seat for children. The market wagon is open in front, used for hauling produce, livestock, or larger loads. The courting buggy is a smaller open carriage with 2 seats, used by unmarried young men to take young women on Sunday afternoon drives, a tradition we will dig into much later when we get to the topic of courtship. There are also work wagons, sleigh-style winter vehicles, and specialized hearses used for funerals. Each one has its purpose, none of them are decorative. The plain community does not generally own things just to own them. Every vehicle on the farm earns its place. The bishop's comment about the 50-mile radius is worth coming back to, because it explains so much about how this whole arrangement holds together. When a family lives within a 15-mile circle, several things happen automatically. Their children attend the same one-room schoolhouse as the neighbours' children. Their church district consists of the 30 or 40 families who happen to live in the same circle. Their cousins, aunts and uncles are mostly within reach for an afternoon visit. The bishop, the deacons and the ministers are people they see every 2 weeks at church services. The store they buy groceries from is run by someone they have known for 40 years. There is, in this arrangement, essentially nowhere to hide. Everyone knows what you're doing, who you're with, and how you treat your family. This level of social transparency would feel suffocating to most modern Americans, and the community is aware of that. But for the plain people, it is also a source of accountability, support, and identity. You cannot drift away when everyone you would drift past already knows your name. The buggy, then, is not an artifact of nostalgia. It is a tool, a deliberate piece of community infrastructure, designed and maintained for the specific purpose of keeping life small enough to remain a life. Every detail of its construction, from the battery system to the colour of the roof, reflects centuries of careful thought about what a plain person actually needs to get through a day. The cruise control would not have made it better, but the propane heater absolutely did. The battery-powered turn signals were a hard-fought concession to highway safety, debated for years before the bishops finally approved them. The hydraulic brakes appeared when too many family buggies were crashing on the steeper hills. None of these changes was made lightly, none of them came easily, and none of them altered the fundamental purpose of the vehicle, which remains, as the bishop said, to keep a man from going more than 15 miles from home. When you understand this, you start to see the buggy differently the next time you pass one on the road. It is not a museum piece, it is not a sentimental gesture, it is the visible part of a much larger system, a system that has spent 300 years figuring out how to keep a community together by making the world deliberately smaller. The horse is the engine, the carriage is the frame, the radius is the wall, and inside that wall, an entire civilization continues to operate, one 15-mile circle at a time, while the rest of the country roars past on the highway, going somewhere it probably did not need to be in the first place. If the buggy is the most visible piece of plain technology, the most invisible is the part that actually keeps a modern Amish farm running. Because here is the thing that almost nobody who has only seen the postcards understands. The Amish are not technologically frozen, they are technologically selective. There is an enormous difference between those two things, and once you grasp it, almost every confusing contradiction about the plain community suddenly snaps into focus. The Amish do not refuse new tools because the tools are new. They refuse or accept or modify each new tool based on a careful question. Will this thing pull our community apart, or will it help us keep it together? That question, asked over and over again for the last 100 years, has produced one of the strangest and most fascinating technological cultures on the planet. A culture where a man might milk his cows by hand at 5 a.m. and then walk back to a workshop powered by a $50,000 diesel generator, lit by LED fixtures, ventilated by pneumatic fans and humming with the sound of computer-controlled cutting equipment. All of it perfectly acceptable, none of it touching the electric grid. To understand how this is possible, you have to start with the electric grid itself, because that is the single most important boundary in plain technological theology. The Amish do not refuse electricity. This is the misconception that confuses everyone. What they refuse is the wire coming from the public utility company, that connects their home to the outside world. The wire itself is the problem, not the current. A bishop in central Pennsylvania once put it this way to a curious researcher. The line that runs from the pole to the house, he said, also runs from the world to your kitchen table. Once it is there, you cannot control what flows down it. Today it is just a refrigerator. Tomorrow it is a television. The day after that it is 1,000 things you never asked for. The Amish do not want the line. They are not, however, philosophically opposed to electricity as a force of nature. Lightning, they would point out, is also electricity, and nobody is trying to ban lightning. This distinction between the source of power and the use of power is the entire foundation of what looks from the outside like an enormous web of contradictions. The community has spent 120 years working out, in painstaking detail, which sources of energy are acceptable and which are not. Diesel and propane are widely accepted because they are local. You buy a tank of fuel from a delivery truck, you store it on your own property, you use it, and when it runs out you order another tank. Nothing about that arrangement connects you to a national grid. You are the master of your own energy. Hydraulic and pneumatic systems are widely accepted because they can be driven by diesel power and used in workshops without any external connection. Solar power has gradually become accepted by most communities because the sun is, in their reading, a gift directly from God, with no utility company in the middle. Battery storage, especially lithium-ion battery storage, is accepted with various restrictions, because batteries store energy locally rather than channeling it from somewhere else. What is forbidden is, very specifically, the public utility line. Everything else is up for negotiation. Walk onto a Lancaster Amish dairy farm in 2026, and you will see this philosophy in action. The barn is bright with LED lighting, but the LEDs are powered by a bank of batteries that sit in a small outbuilding. The batteries are charged by an array of solar panels mounted on the south-facing barn roof. The milk cooler runs on a refrigeration system that uses the same battery bank during the day and switches over to a small diesel generator at night when demand is highest. The milking machines, which are required by state milk inspection regulations because hand milking does not meet modern sanitation standards for commercial dairy sales, operate on vacuum pumps driven by a separate diesel motor in the milk house. The water is pumped from a well by a windmill, or sometimes by a small diesel pump if the wind is uncooperative for a few days. The whole system runs without a single connection to the public power grid, and it produces milk that is sold, an hour or two later, to companies whose marketing departments will brand it as wholesome family farm dairy and ship it to grocery stores across 3 states. It is worth pausing on the dairy inspection question for a moment, because it illustrates a recurring tension in plain life. Pennsylvania, like every other state with a serious dairy industry, has strict regulations on how milk is collected, cooled, stored, and transported. Inspectors visit regularly. They check water temperatures in the bulk tank. They check the cleanliness of milking equipment. They check the sanitation of the milk house. None of these requirements is optional, and none of them is going to be waived just because the farmer prefers a slower way of life. The plain community accepted decades ago that selling milk commercially means meeting state standards, and meeting state standards means certain technologies are simply not negotiable. So the milking parlour uses stainless steel pipes and pulsation pumps. The cooler keeps the milk at exactly the required temperature, day and night, without fail. The records are kept, the inspectors come and go, and the bishops have by and large accepted that these particular machines are the price of staying in the commercial dairy business at all. The alternative, which would be to sell milk informally to neighbours and avoid the regulatory system entirely, exists in some smaller communities. But in Lancaster, the dairy farms are large enough and commercial enough that going off the books is simply not an option. The tension between regulatory requirements and plain principles becomes a quiet shaper of which technologies are accepted, sometimes more than the bishop's own preferences would dictate. The same logic that drives the electricity question drives the telephone question, although the telephone has its own peculiar history. The plain community got to telephones earlier than most of the modern technological debates, and they have been arguing about it longer. In the early 1900s, when telephones first started appearing in rural America, several Amish families installed them in their kitchens. The bishops watched what happened next with growing concern. They saw the way the telephone changed the rhythm of social life. Visitors stopped dropping by because they could just call ahead. Long conversations replaced short visits. The line of separation between the household and the outside world, which had been physically clear, suddenly had a small electronic gate punched through it. By the 1910s, the bishops had ruled that telephones were not acceptable inside the home. They had also, however, recognised that telephones were genuinely useful for business and emergencies. The compromise that emerged was the phone shanty, also called the phone shack or the phone booth, depending on the community. A small wooden structure, usually no bigger than an outhouse, placed at the end of a long driveway or shared between 2 or 3 neighbouring farms, containing a single landline telephone. The phone shanty was, and still is, brilliant in its simplicity. The phone is available when you need it. Walking out to the end of the driveway to make a call is just enough effort that you do not make casual calls, you make necessary ones. Incoming calls go to an answering machine, which the family checks once or twice a day. Long conversations are uncomfortable because the shanty is unheated in winter, and you cannot leave the receiver dangling while you cook dinner. The telephone, in this arrangement, becomes a tool you use, not a presence in your home. The principle, the bishops would say, is that you control the technology rather than the technology controlling you. The shanty is the wall that maintains that control. In the last 2 decades, this arrangement has had to absorb the smartphone, which is, from a plain community perspective, the most theologically challenging device ever invented. A smartphone is a telephone, yes, but it is also a computer, a camera, a map, a music player, a library, a portal to every video and image and message in the modern world, all packed into something that fits in your pocket and is, by design, almost impossible to put down. The Amish response to the smartphone has been remarkably consistent across most communities. It is forbidden for personal use. Members are not supposed to own one. Members are not supposed to use one in their homes. Members are absolutely not supposed to use one for entertainment, social media, photography of community members, or general internet browsing. The bishops have not pulled punches on this one. The smartphone in their reading is the most dangerous technology of the last 100 years, and they are not interested in finding a compromise on it. The complication is business. By the 2020s, almost every Amish-run small business in Lancaster needed some kind of phone, and increasingly some kind of internet connection, to function. Suppliers stopped accepting orders by mail. Customers expected to be able to reach a business by phone during the workday. Wholesale dairy operations needed to receive electronic alerts when milk tanks reached certain temperatures. Construction crews working off-site needed to communicate with the Home Office. The community has handled this through a series of careful concessions, mostly involving devices kept at the workplace rather than in the home, and used only for specific business purposes. A construction company might have a flip phone, kept in the truck, used only for calls to clients and suppliers. A dairy might have a basic cell phone in the milk house, used only for monitoring equipment alerts. A furniture shop might have a landline and a basic email account, with email accessed through a non-Amish bookkeeper who handles the correspondence. The principle is consistent. The technology stays at the business. It does not come into the home, and it is used for narrow defined purposes, not for general engagement with the modern world. There are naturally gaps in the system. Younger Amish workers, especially those working in non-Amish businesses or running their own small companies, have been quietly acquiring smartphones at higher rates than the bishops are entirely comfortable with. There are also widely reported stories of Amish teenagers hiding flip phones under their mattresses, or charging smartphones at a neighbour's English house, or borrowing devices for an evening of music and texting before returning them. The community is aware of all of this. The bishops periodically address it from the pulpit. Sometimes a young man caught with an unauthorised smartphone is required to confess at a church service and surrender the device. Sometimes the matter is handled more quietly. The general consensus among researchers who study the plain community is that the rules around smartphones are bending faster than the bishops would prefer, but the wall is still standing, and most Amish homes remain free of internet-connected devices. Whether that will still be true in 20 years is one of the open questions about the community's future. Cars and trucks have a similar history of theological argument. The Amish do not drive. This rule has held since the early 1900s, when affordable automobiles first started reaching rural America. The bishops at the time recognized correctly that the car was going to transform American life in ways that were fundamentally incompatible with how they wanted their own community to function. A car would let young people travel to cities. It would let men work 50 miles from home. It would let families live separately from their parents and grandparents. The car would, in their reading, do to the community what the telephone had threatened to do, only on a much larger scale. The bishops drew the line firmly. Members were not permitted to own cars. They were not permitted to drive cars. Even riding in a car for non-essential purposes was discouraged. But the line, as with the telephone, allowed for practical accommodations. A member could ride in a car if someone else was driving. A member could hire a driver, almost always a local non-Amish neighbour, to take the family on longer trips that were impractical by buggy. These hired drivers, sometimes called Amish taxis though never to their faces, are a small industry in Lancaster County and other large Amish areas. A typical driver is a retiree or part-time worker who owns a reliable minivan or SUV and has built up a list of Amish families who call him for rides to doctor's appointments, weddings in other counties, funerals, or longer business trips. The rates are agreed upon in advance, the trips are scheduled in advance, and the relationship is purely transactional. The driver provides the vehicle and the operation. The Amish family provides the destination and the payment. The line between using a car and owning a car is maintained, even though the practical effect in terms of getting from one place to another is nearly identical. The same logic extends to commercial trucks. An Amish-owned construction business cannot own a truck, but it can lease equipment from a non-Amish provider who handles the trucking, or it can hire English drivers to transport materials. Many of the larger Amish furniture and shed building operations have arrangements with trucking companies who pick up finished products and deliver them to customers across the eastern United States. The Amish business owner never sits behind the wheel. The truck simply arrives, loads, and leaves. The arrangement is technical, but it is consistent with the principle. The community is not trying to live without the modern transportation network. They are trying to live without becoming individually dependent on it. This brings us to the broader pattern that researchers have called the lookout, although the term that the Amish themselves sometimes use is more pointed. They speak of staying separate. The decisions about which technologies to accept, modify, or reject are not random. They follow a recognizable pattern, even if the bishops have never written it down in any formal way. Technologies that strengthen the family and the local community tend to be accepted. Technologies that strengthen the individual at the expense of the community tend to be rejected. A diesel generator, which powers a shared workshop where fathers and sons work together, is fine. A personal smartphone, which gives one teenager a private connection to 1 million strangers, is not. A solar panel array, which powers an entire farm operation that supports an extended family, is fine. A television in the living room, which would replace family conversation with passive consumption of stories from outside the community, is not. The principle is consistent even when the specific decisions look strange to outsiders. There are smaller examples of this pattern everywhere, once you start looking. Battery-powered hand tools like cordless drills are widely used by Amish carpenters and have been for 30 years, because they do not connect to the grid and they do not change the social structure of the workshop. Power tools driven by air compressors, which can be huge and sophisticated machines, are widely used in furniture shops and metalworking operations. The compressor itself runs on diesel, and the airlines distribute power to whatever station needs it. Pneumatic saws, pneumatic drills, pneumatic sanders, pneumatic nail guns, all of these are common. To an outsider, walking into an Amish furniture shop is almost indistinguishable from walking into a non-Amish one, except for the fact that everything is run on air pressure rather than electricity, and the workers are wearing suspenders. The productivity, the precision, and the quality of the output are essentially identical to what a comparable English shop would produce. The pneumatic option is so dominant in plain workshops that there is a small sub-industry that has grown up to convert ordinary electric tools into air-powered versions. A standard sander or drill press from a hardware store can be rebuilt, with the right machinist's help, to run on compressed air instead of a wall plug. Lancaster has at least half a dozen specialty shops that do nothing but this kind of conversion work, modifying standard equipment for Amish customers and shipping the modified tools across the country. The conversions are not always cheap, and they sometimes reduce the power output of the original tool by a noticeable amount, but the result is a workshop full of equipment that satisfies both the plain principles and the practical demands of a modern small business. It is, in its quiet way, a small miracle of adaptive engineering, the kind of thing that would make an industrial historian very happy if the industrial historian could be persuaded to drive out to Lancaster and look at it. Refrigeration is another good example of how the boundary lines actually work. Refrigerators are necessary for any modern household, particularly for families who keep their own dairy and meat. The plain community accepted this need decades ago. The compromise was the propane refrigerator, sometimes called a gas fridge, which works on the same basic principle as a conventional fridge, but uses a propane-fueled absorption cooling system rather than an electric compressor. These refrigerators look almost identical to ordinary ones from the outside, with the same general size and the same general internal layout. They are quieter than electric models, actually, and they are surprisingly efficient. They cost more to buy, but they last longer, and they run perfectly during the kind of multi-day power outages that occasionally flatten rural Pennsylvania during ice storms. An Amish family during a winter blackout does not, of course, notice the blackout, because nothing in their house was plugged into the grid in the first place. Their lights still work, their fridge still works, their stove still works. The neighbours across the field, whose grid-tied house has gone dark, sometimes come over to borrow flashlights or warm milk. This happens often enough that the plain community has a quiet, polite affection for ice storms. Washing machines deserve their own short detour because they show the same logic at a smaller scale. The Amish use washing machines. They have used them for a very long time. The early models were powered by small gasoline engines and resembled the appliances that mainstream American households used in the 1920s and 1930s before electricity standardized the design. Modern Amish washing machines look almost identical to ordinary ones, except that they are powered by a compressed air motor or a small diesel engine rather than an electric one. They sit in basements, washrooms, or shared laundry buildings, hooked up to water and to the same hot water systems that supply the kitchen. The clothes go in, the agitator works, the spin cycle finishes, and the wet laundry comes out. From there it goes onto a clothesline, almost always, because mechanical dryers are still rare in plain households. A long row of black trousers and blue dresses flapping in the spring wind, hung in size order along a line stretched between two posts, is one of the iconic visual signatures of Amish farm life. The community has not banned dryers in principle. It is just that line drying works perfectly well, costs nothing, and produces clothes that smell of sunshine rather than chemical softeners. Dryers exist in some homes, particularly during the winter and rainy seasons, but they are propane-fueled rather than electric, and they are used as a backup rather than a default. Lighting has gone through its own slow evolution. For most of the 20th century, Amish homes were lit by kerosene lamps and naphtha gas lamps, mounted on walls or hung from ceilings, requiring daily maintenance and producing a soft yellow light that almost everyone who has experienced it remembers fondly. By the 1990s, propane lighting had largely replaced kerosene in most Lancaster households, partly because propane is cleaner and partly because it produces a brighter light. In the last 15 years, battery-powered LED lighting has been quietly added to the mix, especially in barns and workshops. The technology that bishops were debating in 2010 is now standard in most New Order Amish homes and increasingly common in Old Order ones. The lights are powered by deep-cycle batteries, charged by solar panels on the roof. The result is a level of indoor brightness that would have been unimaginable in a plain household 50 years ago, and that to an outsider walking in at night looks essentially identical to any other modern home, except of course that no wire connects it to the grid. Even the question of computers and digital technology has produced unexpected compromises. The Amish do not allow personal computers in the home. They do not allow internet access for personal use. But many Amish businesses use what are sometimes called classic word processors, which are essentially stripped-down computers loaded with bookkeeping software, customer database software, and basic spreadsheet capabilities, with the internet and most entertainment functions physically disabled. A furniture shop might have one of these machines in the office, used by a non-Amish bookkeeper or by an Amish employee who's been given specific permission. A small construction company might use a similar device for project estimates and invoicing. The machine is treated, in the community's logic, as a calculator rather than a computer, even though anyone trained in modern technology would recognize that the distinction is paper-thin. The point, again, is not to be logically pure. The point is to keep the daily life of the household plain and to allow whatever technology is necessary to keep the business viable. As long as the work tool stays at work, it does not threaten the home. This entire system relies on something that an outsider would find difficult to construct from scratch. It relies on a community-wide agreement about what is acceptable, enforced not by laws but by social consensus, and renegotiated continually as new technologies arrive. The bishops do not have a written rulebook for technology. They have instead ongoing conversations district by district about specific items. When a new tool appears, the question is debated. Sometimes the answer is yes, with conditions. Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes the answer is yes for now, let us see how it goes. Communities watch each other. A practice that becomes common in one church district will eventually be discussed in neighbouring districts, and the bishops will decide whether to accept, reject, or modify it. The system is, in some ways, more flexible than the formal rulemaking of mainstream society, because it can adapt to local conditions and respond to changing circumstances without going through a national legislative process. It is also slower and more cautious, because consensus must be reached, and the burden of proof is always on the new technology to demonstrate that it will not harm the community. Researchers who have studied this decision-making process up close describe a fascinating informal pattern. When a new technology first appears, a few adventurous community members will quietly try it. They are usually small business owners, often younger men, who have a specific economic reason to want the tool. They use it carefully, mostly at the workplace, and they do not advertise their experiment. Other community members notice. Conversations happen at church. The local bishop pays a visit, sometimes friendly, sometimes more pointed. If the bishop concludes that the technology is creating problems, the user is asked to stop. If the bishop concludes that it is genuinely useful and not harmful, the experiment is quietly tolerated and the practice begins to spread. Eventually, the regional ministers may discuss it formally at one of their semi-annual meetings, and a more permanent decision will be made. The whole process can take anywhere from a few months to a couple of decades, depending on the technology and the community. The Amish are not in a hurry. They have, as it turns out, all the time in the world to figure out whether a new gadget is worth absorbing. This is also why different Amish communities, separated by only a few hundred miles, often have surprisingly different rules. A technology that has been accepted in Lancaster might be forbidden in northern Indiana. A practice that is standard among the New Order in Holmes County, Ohio, might be considered too liberal in a Pennsylvania community an hour to the east. The rules are not centralized. There is no Amish pope, no national governing body, no synod that issues binding rulings. Each church district makes its own decisions in conversation with its neighbors, and the result is the patchwork of practices that we've been describing. To an outsider, this looks chaotic. To the community, it looks like local self-government, which is, in their reading, exactly how things should be. The most fascinating recent example of this in action is the rise of off-grid energy. The Plain community got into solar power early. By the late 1990s, when most Americans still considered solar panels an expensive novelty, certain New Order Amish communities had already started experimenting with small solar arrays on barn roofs. The reasoning was straightforward. Solar power is local. It is silent. It is fueled by the sun, which belongs to no one. It produces electricity that can be stored in batteries and used for a wide range of purposes, all without ever connecting to the public grid. By the 2000s, solar had moved from a New Order curiosity to a Lancaster Old Order common practice. By the 2020s, the technology was so widespread that a major industry had emerged specifically to serve the Amish solar market. There are now Amish-owned solar installation companies, Amish-owned battery distribution businesses, and Amish-owned generator repair shops, all serving Plain customers who want off-grid systems for their farms and homes. The community has, in a quiet way, become one of the most advanced rural users of distributed energy in North America, a fact that almost nobody outside the industry has noticed. The lithium-ion battery revolution has accelerated this even further. The same battery chemistry that powers electric cars has made it economically possible to store large amounts of solar-generated electricity for nighttime use, leveling out the supply problem that always plagued off-grid systems. An Amish farm in Lancaster County in 2026 can now produce, store, and use enough electricity to run a substantial dairy operation, a large workshop, and a fully lit family home, all from solar panels and battery banks on the property, with a small diesel generator as backup for cloudy weeks. The system costs tens of thousands of dollars to install, sometimes well over $100,000 for a larger operation, but it pays itself back in a few years through avoided utility costs and the increased productivity of off-grid lighting and refrigeration. The bishops, who once would have viewed any large electrical system with deep suspicion, have generally allowed these arrangements because the underlying principle is preserved. The farm is not connected to the world. The energy is local. The technology is, in their reading, separate enough to be acceptable. What this all amounts to, when you step back and look at the whole picture, is one of the most carefully engineered hybrid cultures in modern history. The plain community has not refused to participate in the technological era. They have instead taken 100 years of careful argument and built themselves a parallel economy, one in which modern productivity is preserved while modern social fragmentation is held at bay. The diesel generator hums in the workshop. The solar panels gleam on the barn roof. The pneumatic tools whir in the carpentry shed. The phone shanty waits at the end of the lane, and inside the house, the family eats together at a wooden table, lit by propane lamps or by LEDs running off a battery with no television, no radio, no smartphone, and no advertising pushing into the room from outside. The line between the workshop and the kitchen is drawn deliberately and maintained carefully. On one side of the line, the modern world is allowed to do useful work. On the other side, the world is held politely at arm's length. It is, when you actually understand it, less a rejection of technology than a remarkably sophisticated negotiation with it. The community is not asking to escape the 21st century. They are asking to participate in it on their own terms, and so far, those terms appear to be holding. This is also, by the way, the answer to one of the most common outsider complaints about the Amish, which is the accusation that they are hypocritical for accepting modern conveniences while preaching simple living. The complaint usually goes something like this. They drive in cars when it suits them, they use cell phones for business, they install solar panels and run their workshops on diesel power, so what is the point of the bonnets and the buggies? The complaint, while understandable, misunderstands the entire framework. The Amish are not trying to live like 1800s farmers. They are not trying to live without modern tools at all. They are trying to live as a separate community, distinct from the surrounding society, with strong family ties, strong local institutions, and a religious life that takes priority over economic activity. The technological choices are tools, not the goal. The buggy is not a goal. The kerosene lamp is not a goal. The goal is the community itself, and every technological decision is made in service of that goal. If a tool helps preserve the community, it gets in. If it threatens the community, it stays out. The result will always look inconsistent to anyone who expects the rules to follow a simple anti-modern logic, because the rules do not follow that logic. They follow a different one entirely, and that logic, more than 3 centuries old, is still going strong on these gently rolling fields, one carefully negotiated technology at a time. All of the technological negotiations we just walked through, the buggy debates, the solar panel approvals, the careful conversations about phones and pneumatic tools, raise an obvious question that we have not yet answered. Who is actually doing the deciding? Because every time we said the bishops decided this, or the community accepted that, we were skipping past one of the most important and least understood features of plain life. There is no Amish constitution, there is no written code of laws, there is no pope, no synod, no national church council, no centralized authority of any kind. And yet, somehow, hundreds of thousands of people scattered across 30 states and 2 countries manage to live by recognizably consistent rules, hold recognizably similar values, and respond to recognizably similar problems in recognizably similar ways. The mechanism that makes this possible is one of the most quietly remarkable pieces of social engineering in modern North America, and it deserves a careful look. The mechanism is called the Ordnung. The word comes from German, and it means roughly order or arrangement or the way things are done. It is the unwritten code that governs every aspect of life in a plain community, from the colour of a buggy roof to the cut of a man's beard to the question of whether a particular workshop can install a new air compressor. The Ordnung is not, however, a document. There is no book you can open to look up the rule. There is no website where the regulations are published. There is no central office that issues amendments. The Ordnung exists, instead, in the collective memory and ongoing practice of each church district, communicated from generation to generation by teaching, example, and conversation. To live in a plain community is to know the Ordnung by feel, the way a fluent speaker knows the rules of a language without being able to explain them out loud. This unwritten quality is not a bug, It is the entire point. The bishops have considered, many times over the centuries, whether to write down the Ordnung in some formal way, and the answer has always been no. The reasoning is theological and practical. Theologically, the community believes that writing down a code of behaviour creates a temptation toward legalism, the religious habit of focusing on the letter of the law rather than the spirit of it. A written rule becomes a thing to argue about. A written rule becomes a thing to find loopholes in. A written rule, the bishops would say, separates the community from God by inserting a piece of paper between the believer and the requirement of faithful living. The Ordnung is meant to be carried in the heart, not consulted in a binder. Practically, an unwritten code can change with circumstances. When a new technology appears, the Ordnung can quietly absorb a ruling about it without requiring a formal amendment process. When a particular practice falls out of favour, it can fade away without anyone having to officially repeal anything. The flexibility of the oral tradition allows the community to adapt while still feeling from the inside that nothing essential has changed. But unwritten does not mean unspecific. The Ordnung covers an extraordinary level of detail, and every member of the community understands these details with the kind of precision that outsiders find astonishing. The Ordnung specifies, in each Old Order Amish community, the exact width of a man's hat brim, the precise length of a married man's beard, the acceptable colours of a woman's dress, the maximum size of a household garden, the kinds of farm equipment that can be used in the fields, the manner of bowing during prayer, the exact wording of certain phrases in church services, the proper response when meeting a stranger on the road. It specifies whether children can ride bicycles, scooters, or only walk to school. It specifies how a wedding service is conducted, what foods are served at funeral lunches, and what kind of hymns are sung at each Sunday service. It specifies whether a young man may part his hair on the side or only down the middle. None of this is written down, all of it is known. The way this knowledge is transmitted is itself fascinating. A child growing up in a plain community absorbs the Ordnung in the same way a child anywhere absorbs the unwritten rules of their family, watching, listening, being corrected, being praised. By the time a young person reaches their teenage years, they have a complete working knowledge of the rules that govern their world, even if they have never been formally taught any of them. When questions arise, as they inevitably do, the answer is given in conversation, usually by a parent or grandparent, sometimes by a minister, sometimes by the bishop himself. The questions are not, on the whole, controversial. They are more like clarifications. May I wear this kind of shoe to work? May I use this particular wheelbarrow design? May I drive my buggy on this particular road late at night? Most of the time, the answer is obvious to everyone involved, drawn from the shared understanding of what plain life means in this particular district at this particular time. When questions are not obvious, the matter goes up the chain of authority, and to understand how that chain works, we need to map out the actual structure of an Amish church. The basic unit is the church district, which is a geographic area containing roughly 30 to 40 families. The boundaries of a district are drawn pragmatically, based on how far the church benches and the worshippers can reasonably travel by buggy on a Sunday morning. When a district grows too large to fit comfortably in any one of its members' houses for Sunday service, it divides. A line is drawn through the middle, often along a road or a creek, and the two halves become two separate church districts, each with its own leadership. This division process has been going on for generations, and it is why a single Amish settlement can contain dozens of overlapping districts, each with slightly different practices, even though they all live on neighbouring farms. Above the districts sits something called the settlement, which is a regional grouping of districts that share broadly similar practices and recognise each other's leaders as legitimate. Lancaster, taken as a whole, is a single settlement, containing somewhere between 200 and 250 active church districts. Holmes County in Ohio is another large settlement, with a similar number of districts. Indiana has several major settlements, including the very large LaGrange and Elkhart areas. Settlements are not formal organisations. They have no central office, no shared budget, no elected representatives. But the bishops within a settlement know each other personally, gather periodically to discuss common questions, and tend to keep their ordnungs roughly aligned with one another, so that members can move between districts within the settlement without major disruption. If a young couple from one district marries into a family in a neighbouring district, they can usually transfer their membership without having to relearn an entirely new set of expectations. The settlement in this sense is the level at which a recognisable Amish identity is maintained across many local communities. Between settlements, the rules can differ noticeably. A Lancaster Old Order family that moves to a settlement in Wisconsin will find that things look familiar in their broad outlines but different in many specifics. The local ordning might allow different colours of buggy roofs, different rules about pneumatic tools, different conventions for women's dress. The new family will generally be expected to adapt to local practice, rather than insisting on the customs of their old district. There is a saying among the bishops that has been passed around in various forms for a long time. When you move under a new bishop. The principle is straightforward, the ordnung is local. Crossing settlement lines means accepting a new local code, and most families understand this when they make the decision to relocate. Each church district has 4 positions of leadership, and the way these positions are filled is one of the more theologically interesting features of plain life. There is a bishop, who is the senior authority of the district. There are 2 ministers who preach at services and assist the bishop. There is a deacon, whose role we will come to in a moment. None of these men, and they are always men in the Old Order tradition, applies for the position. None of them campaigns for it. None of them is elected in the way that mainstream Protestant churches elect their leaders. Instead, the positions are filled by what the community calls lot, which is, in essence, a religious lottery. When a position opens up, every adult man in the congregation who's in good standing nominates one candidate. The candidates who receive multiple nominations are placed before the congregation. A set of identical hymn books is prepared, one for each candidate, and inside one of the hymn books is a slip of paper marked with a Bible verse. The candidates choose hymn books at random. Whoever opens the book with the slip of paper is the new minister or bishop or deacon. The community believes that God, not human politics, has chosen this person for the role. The consequences of this system are striking. A man who is selected by lot does not become a minister because he wanted the job. In many cases, he becomes a minister despite actively not wanting the job. There are documented stories of men weeping when they draw the marked hymn book because they understand that the rest of their life is about to change in ways they did not ask for. The position carries no salary. The new minister will continue to work his farm or run his business, while simultaneously taking on the demanding spiritual and administrative duties of leading a congregation. He will preach without formal theological training. He will counsel families through marital difficulties, advise young people on important decisions, and bear the weight of the community's confidence in his judgment, all while putting in a full week of physical labour and raising his own children. The job is, by any reasonable measure, exhausting, and the men who get it tend to be the ones who would have been most reluctant to seek it out, which is, the community would say, exactly the point. God chooses humble men, and the lot ensures that humility remains the price of entry. The bishop is the highest authority in the district. He alone has the power to perform baptisms, weddings, communion services, and ordinations. He alone has the final say on questions of church discipline. He alone presides over the semi-annual members' meetings where the ordning is reviewed and reaffirmed. A bishop is selected from among the existing ministers of the district when the previous bishop dies or retires, and the selection is again by lot, with the existing ministers as the pool of candidates. Once chosen, the bishop serves for life, although in practice some bishops eventually step back from active duties when age or health makes the job too demanding. The bishops of neighbouring districts know each other well. They visit each other's services. They consult on difficult questions. They form, collectively, a kind of informal regional council that maintains the broad consistency of plain practice across a settlement, even though no formal organisation connects them. The ministers, of whom there are usually 2 per district, share the preaching duties at Sunday services. In a typical Amish service, the bishop will deliver the shorter opening sermon and the ministers will deliver the longer main sermon, with the assignments rotating. Preaching is done without notes, often without prior preparation in any formal sense, because the community believes that the Holy Spirit guides the minister's words in the moment. The sermons can run an hour or longer, delivered in a sing-song cadence that is itself a recognisable feature of plain worship, and they typically focus on practical applications of biblical principles, rather than on abstract theological argument. The congregation listens in respectful silence, the men and women seated on separate sides of the room, with children among them. There are no offerings collected during the service. There are no announcements about upcoming committee meetings. There is no praise band, no projection screen, no printed program. The service is, in form, almost identical to the way the first Anabaptists worshipped in the 1500s, which is, of course, not an accident. The deacon is the fourth position, and his role is the most easily overlooked, but in some ways the most important. The deacon assists with services, reads scripture passages out loud, and helps administer baptisms. But his real job is something else entirely. The deacon is the only person in the district who has direct access to the community fund. He collects money from members when special needs arise. He distributes that money to families who need help. He visits widows, orphans, the sick, and those facing financial hardship. He maintains, in his head and in his handwritten records, a quiet ledger of who has given and who has received, although the community generally tries not to talk about specific amounts. The deacon is, in functional terms, the chief executive officer of the community's mutual aid system, although he would never describe himself in those terms. The position requires patience, discretion, and a remarkable level of trust, because the deacon handles substantial amounts of money in cash without any external auditing, and the community simply has to believe that he is doing the right thing with it. The fact that this system works year after year without scandal says something significant about the social fabric that supports it. The deacon has another duty that is less talked about but equally important. He is the one who, when a member crosses a clear line of the ordning, makes the first visit. The bishop does not knock on the door of a wayward family. The deacon does. He arrives, often unannounced, with a quiet greeting and a willingness to listen. The conversation is not framed as an accusation. It is framed as a concern, a gentle inquiry into how things are going, an invitation for the member to share what is on their heart. If the issue is something minor, a misunderstanding, a moment of temptation, a family stress that has spilled into questionable behaviour, the deacon's visit may be enough to set things right. If the issue is more serious, the deacon will report back to the bishop and the formal process of correction begins. There is a phrase that older members sometimes use when they say a deacon is coming, and the phrase carries a particular weight. The deacon's visit is not feared, exactly, but it is not welcomed lightly either. It means the community has noticed something. It means the conversation has begun. The community fund itself deserves a brief explanation, because the way it works is unlike anything in mainstream church finance. There is no formal pledge system. There are no weekly offering plates passed during services. When a need arises, the deacon goes to the members, individually or collectively, and asks for contributions. The amounts are determined by what families can give and what the need actually is. A family whose barn has burned down may receive tens of thousands of dollars in direct support, plus the labour of dozens of neighbours who arrive to rebuild it. A widow who needs help with medical bills may receive whatever the deacon's quiet calculation determines is appropriate. A young couple starting out on a small farm may receive a modest loan from the fund at terms more generous than any bank would offer. The money flows where it is needed, without paperwork, without committees, without applications. It works because everybody knows everybody, and the deacon is trusted to know who genuinely needs help and who is simply having a rough patch that they can work through on their own. There is one more role that does not get filled by lot, but plays a critical part in the district: the hosting family. Every 2 weeks, the church service rotates from one family's home to another. The hosting family is responsible for preparing the space, setting up the church benches, providing the noon meal after the service, and generally absorbing the considerable logistical burden of having 75 to 150 people in their home for a full day. The benches themselves are stored in a community-owned bench wagon, a special wagon that travels from family to family every other Sunday, carrying the long wooden benches that the congregation sits on. The bench wagon is one of those quiet pieces of plain infrastructure that almost nobody outside the community knows exists, even though it is the literal physical foundation of how worship happens. The hosting role rotates so that every family gets a turn, and every family understands that hosting will fall to them roughly once every 2 or 3 years. The semi-annual members' meetings, called Ordnungsgeme, or sometimes simply preparation services, are when the ordning itself is formally reaffirmed and adjusted. These meetings happen twice a year, in the spring and in the fall, 2 weeks before the communion services that the community considers the most sacred events of the church year. At the Ordnungsgeme, the bishop reads through the district's understanding of how plain life is to be conducted. He addresses any disputes that have arisen since the last meeting. He confronts, if necessary, members who have crossed important lines. He invites discussion of new technologies or practices that have appeared in the community. The members present, who are all adult baptized members of the church, must reach unanimous agreement that they are at peace with each other and with the Ordnung before communion can be celebrated. If even one member is in a state of unresolved conflict with another, communion is postponed until reconciliation has occurred. The threat of a delayed communion is a powerful one. It puts community-wide pressure on members to resolve disputes rather than let them fester. It also means that the Ordnung is not, in any meaningful sense, imposed by the bishop from above. It is, every 6 months, freshly accepted by the entire adult membership of the district through their willingness to take communion under it. This is where the genius of the unwritten constitution really shows itself. The Ordnung is not a fixed set of rules. It is a living agreement, renegotiated continuously and ratified twice a year by every adult member of the community. When a member loses confidence in a particular rule, they have an opportunity to raise that concern. When a new circumstance arises, the bishop can address it. When the community drifts in a direction the bishop considers dangerous, he can pull it back, but he cannot do so unilaterally. The members must agree. And because the members have agreed, by the act of taking communion, they have personal ownership of the rules that govern their lives. The Ordnung is not done to them, it is done by them. This is a profound difference in how authority works, and it is one of the main reasons that plain communities have been able to maintain their distinctiveness for centuries without resorting to coercion. Nobody's forced to live this way. They choose, every 6 months, to keep choosing it. Of course, the system has its tensions, and these tensions sometimes produce open conflict. There have been moments in plain history when a particular Ordnung change has divided a settlement deeply enough to cause a permanent split. The introduction of telephones in workplaces, the decision about whether to allow battery-powered headlights on buggies, the question of how strictly to apply shunning to family members who have joined a Mennonite church. Each of these moments has produced its own quiet rupture, somewhere in the broader plain world. A district that decided one way watched a few families leave for a stricter district that decided the other way. A bishop who pressed for a particular change found himself outvoted by his own ministers, with consequences that lasted decades. The system is not always smooth, it is not always gentle, and the price of unanimous consent is that, when consent cannot be reached, the only honourable option is sometimes separation. The plain world is built on the principle that walking away from a church you no longer believe in is preferable to staying inside it under false pretences. The doors are closed but never locked, and a small number of members walk through them in every generation. The communion services themselves, held in the spring and fall after the preparation meetings, are full-day events that the community considers sacred in a way that few outsiders fully appreciate. The service can run 6 or 7 hours, with extended scripture readings, multiple sermons, the ceremonial washing of feet between members, the sharing of bread and wine, and a meditative quietness that fills the room from morning until late afternoon. The foot washing in particular is a feature of plain worship that mainstream Christianity has largely abandoned, but for the Amish it remains a literal enactment of Jesus' instruction to his disciples. Pairs of members, men with men and women with women, take turns washing each other's feet in basins of warm water, drying them with towels and offering each other a holy kiss. The practice is meant to embody humility, equality, and forgiveness. Nobody is too important to wash someone else's feet. Nobody is too humble to have their feet washed. The service is also, by tradition, when serious matters of church discipline are formally addressed, including any cases of excommunication, which is the most severe sanction the community can impose. When excommunication happens, the procedure is as careful as everything else in plain life. A member who has been excommunicated, called being placed in the ban, is treated, after a period of warnings and attempts at reconciliation, as cut off from the spiritual fellowship of the community. The practical effects depend on which group we're talking about. In the strictest old order communities, the ban is comprehensive. Other members are not to eat at the same table with the banned member, not to do business with them, not to ride in a vehicle with them, not to accept gifts from them. Even immediate family is expected to maintain this separation, at least at the formal level of meals and business transactions, although the rules around basic family communication are usually applied more gently. In the Mennonite communities that practice a milder form of shunning, the consequences are more limited, often confined to refusing communion with the banned member, but not extending into daily life. The purpose of the ban in either case is not punishment. It is, the bishops would say, a tool of redemption. The hope is that the banned member will eventually return, confess, and be reinstated. Many do, some do not. Either way, the practice of the ban traces straight back to the writings of Menno Simons and Jacob Ammon, and it remains one of the most distinctive and most controversial features of plain church life. Before a ban is ever issued, however, a long process of correction is supposed to unfold. The pattern follows a direct reading of a passage in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus describes a series of steps for handling disputes between believers. First, one member goes privately to another to discuss the concern, just the two of them. If that does not resolve the matter, 2 or 3 witnesses are brought along for a second conversation. If the issue still remains unsettled, it is brought to the church as a whole. Only after these steps have been tried and the offender has refused to repent does the bishop bring the question of formal discipline to the congregation. The whole process can take months. In some cases, it stretches across years. The community is not in a hurry to cast anyone out. The bishops would generally rather absorb a slow-developing problem than rush a decision that might break a family or push someone away from the faith permanently. There are stories of members who lived under quiet, informal pressure for a decade before either changing their behaviour or formally separating from the church on their own terms. A word should be said about the role of women in this structure, because outsiders often assume that the lack of female leadership in the formal positions means women have no influence on the ordning at all. The reality is more complicated. Officially, no woman serves as bishop, minister, or deacon. Women do not preach at services. Women do not vote on ordinations. But the practical influence of plain women on the daily life of the community, and therefore on the actual shape of the ordnung as it is lived out, is substantial. Mothers raise children. Mothers transmit the dialect, the songs, the prayers, the cooking, the dress conventions, the manners, and the religious habits that constitute plain life on the ground. Wives speak frankly to their husbands about how the church is going. The bishop hears from his wife at the dinner table about what the women in the district are concerned about. Disputes that surface between families are often noticed first by women and resolved first through women's conversations, long before any formal involvement of the male leadership becomes necessary. The public structure is unambiguously patriarchal. The lived reality includes a strong informal current of female influence that runs alongside it, often shaping outcomes more than anyone formally acknowledges. To understand how unusual this whole system is, it helps to compare it to the way mainstream American churches operate. Most modern Protestant congregations have written constitutions, elected boards, formal budgets approved by member vote, paid clergy with seminary degrees, denominational headquarters that issue official statements on contested questions, and a clear separation between the church as institution and the congregation as community. Decisions get made by committees. Disputes are resolved by parliamentary procedure. Membership is a matter of signing forms. The plain community has none of this. No constitution, no boards, no budget meetings, no paid clergy, no denominational headquarters, no committees. The system operates on personal relationships, oral tradition, unanimous consent, and a deep collective memory of what plain life is supposed to look like. It should not work. By every standard of organizational theory, it should have collapsed long ago into chaos. Instead, it has been operating with remarkable stability for centuries, and the communities that use it continue to grow at a rate that mainstream denominations would envy. The strength of the system in the end comes from the fact that it is embedded in everything else. The ordning is not a separate thing that exists alongside daily life. It is daily life. When you wake up in a plain household and put on your plain clothes and eat plain food and go to your plain work and speak your plain dialect and worship at your neighbour's house, and bury your dead in your neighbour's field, the rules are not external constraints on these activities. They are the activities. The system holds together because it is the entire life of the community, not just one part of it. Take away the buggies and the dress code and the unwritten code of behaviour, and you have not removed a layer of restrictions from a free people. You have dissolved the community itself, because the community is constituted by these very things. There is also a quieter feature of the leadership culture that deserves a brief mention, because it shapes how authority actually feels from the inside. The bishops and ministers of a plain community do not generally speak much in public outside of the church service itself. They do not give interviews. They do not write opinion columns. They do not address the press during community events. The plain doctrine of humility, drawn from a particular reading of the New Testament instruction to take the lowest seat, is taken with deep seriousness by the men who hold these positions. A bishop who became known for his strong personality, his eloquence, or his public visibility would be seen, within his own community, as somehow having failed at the assignment. The job is to lead by example, by quiet conversation, by faithful preaching, and by patient counsel. The job is not to be a public figure. This is part of why outsiders so rarely encounter named Amish bishops in news stories, even when the story is directly about an Amish community. The bishops prefer to remain anonymous. Their authority is rooted in part in the fact that they do not seek attention. A loud bishop, if such a thing could exist, would already be on the way out. This is also why outsiders who try to imagine joining the Amish almost always misunderstand what they would be signing up for. The fantasy is usually about escaping technology, simplifying life, getting back to nature. The reality is about submitting to an enormous web of unwritten expectations enforced by everyone you have ever met. The fantasy is about freedom from modern pressures. The reality is about accepting the weight of a community's collective judgment on every choice you make, from how you cut your hair, to whom you marry, to what kind of fence you build between your barn and your neighbour's pasture. People who do not grow up in this kind of system find it almost impossible to live in, which is why the rate of outside conversions to the Amish church remains close to zero, even as the curiosity of outsiders remains high. The system is not designed to be entered. It is designed to be born into, and the people who are born into it have access to a kind of social structure that essentially no other modern community can offer. Whether that structure looks like a prison or a paradise depends more than anything on the eye of the beholder. From inside it looks like home. From outside it can look like both at once, which is perhaps the most honest answer anyone can give about what the Ordnung really is. There is one more layer of plain life that we have been quietly assuming throughout this entire story without really examining, and it is time to bring it out into the open. The whole system we have just described, the Ordnung, the bishops, the unanimous consent, the door-to-door visits of the deacon, all of it depends on the community sharing a common language. And the language they actually share, the one spoken at the kitchen table and the barn door and the Sunday afternoon visit, is not English. It is something else entirely, something most Americans have never heard, and something that has been quietly preserved on these farms for nearly 300 years, while the rest of the country forgot it ever existed. The language is called Pennsylvania Dutch, which is immediately a confusing name. It is not Dutch. The Dutch in the name is a corruption of Deutsch, the German word for German, which got mangled by English-speaking neighbours who heard the new arrivals call themselves Deutsch and reasonably assumed they were from the Netherlands. The error stuck. By the early 1800s, everyone in Pennsylvania was calling these German-speaking communities the Pennsylvania Dutch, and nobody bothered to correct it, partly because nobody really cared, and partly because the alternative names were even more awkward. Today, the language is properly called Pennsylvania Dutch, sometimes Pennsylvania German in academic settings, and the people who speak it natively just call it Deutsch, which is exactly what their great-great-grandparents called it in 1740. The language itself is a dialect of Southern German, specifically a variant of what linguists call Palatine German, from the Rhineland-Palatinate region of southwestern Germany. When the first plain settlers arrived in Pennsylvania in the late 1600s and early 1700s, they brought their everyday spoken dialect with them. They did not bring a standardized literary German, which most of them did not really speak. They brought the village language of their grandparents, the language used at home and in the fields, full of regional sayings and local idioms and pronunciations that varied slightly from one valley to the next. On the other side of the Atlantic, this Palatine dialect eventually got absorbed and modernized as Standard German became dominant, but in Pennsylvania the language was preserved almost like an insect in amber. The communities were isolated, the families were close-knit, and the language was passed from mother to child without much change for generation after generation. A modern Pennsylvania Dutch speaker, if you dropped them into a small village in the Rhineland-Palatinate region today, could probably make themselves understood with a bit of effort, but the experience would be roughly like a modern English speaker trying to converse with someone using the speech patterns of 1740. The grammar matches, the vocabulary mostly matches, the accent, the rhythm, and a few key words would mark the visitor as someone from a very long time ago. What makes the situation even more interesting is that the language has not been frozen exactly. It has been slowly absorbing English words over the centuries, especially for things that did not exist in 1740. There are no 18th century German words for refrigerator, telephone, or pickup truck, so the speakers simply borrowed the English words and bent them slightly to fit the German grammar. A Pennsylvania Dutch speaker in 2026 might say something like, "Wir haben een alder pickup im Schuppen," which translates roughly to "we have an old pickup in the shed." The word pickup is just sitting there, English in origin, dropped into a German sentence and treated as if it belongs. This kind of casual code switching happens constantly, and it gives the language a remarkable flexibility. It is genuinely a living language, not a museum piece. New words get absorbed when they are needed. Old words get preserved when they still work. The full linguistic reality of a plain household is actually 3 languages running in parallel, which is the kind of detail outsiders rarely appreciate. Pennsylvania Dutch is the everyday spoken language, the one used at the table and in the field. English is the language of school, business, and any contact with the outside world. And Standard High German is the language of worship. The hymnal used in Sunday services, called the Ausbund, was first compiled in the mid-1500s by imprisoned Anabaptists in southern Germany, and it has been used continuously by plain communities for almost 500 years. The hymns are written in Old High German, which is significantly different from both Pennsylvania Dutch and from any version of German you might learn in a modern textbook. The Bible read in homes is usually the Luther translation of 1545, also in Old High German. The Lord's Prayer is recited in High German. Wedding ceremonies, funeral services, and baptisms are all conducted, at least in part, in this older liturgical language. So a typical plain child grows up hearing Pennsylvania Dutch from their parents, learning to read English at school, and learning to read and partially understand High German at church, all simultaneously. By the time they are baptized as adults, they are functionally trilingual, which would be considered an impressive accomplishment in any educational system outside the plain world, and which the plain community itself simply treats as a normal feature of growing up. For most plain children, Pennsylvania Dutch is the first and only language they hear at home for the first 5 or 6 years of their life. Their parents speak it, their grandparents speak it, their siblings speak it, the neighbours who drop by for visits speak it, songs are sung in it, prayers are prayed in it, disagreements are had in it. By the time a child is ready to start school at age 6 or 7, they have a fluent native command of a German dialect, and they have heard relatively little English. Some children, particularly those whose mothers run small businesses that interact with the English-speaking world, will have picked up some English, but many begin school speaking essentially no English at all, and they encounter the language for the first time in a serious way only when they walk into the one-room schoolhouse on their first day. The schoolhouse itself is one of the most distinctive institutions in the entire plain world, and it deserves a careful look. Almost every Amish settlement of any size has its own network of small private schools, built and maintained by the community, staffed by community members, and run on a budget that would horrify a modern American school administrator. A typical Lancaster County Amish school is a single-story wooden building, painted white, sitting on a half-acre lot donated or sold cheaply by a local Amish farmer. The building has, in most cases, exactly 1 classroom, sometimes 2, with a small entry area for boots and coats, a basement that is sometimes used for indoor recess on rainy days, and an outhouse out back. There is no cafeteria, there is no gymnasium, there is no library, beyond a few shelves of books at the back of the room. There is no parking lot for school buses because there are no school buses. The children walk, ride scooters, or come by buggy with older siblings. Inside the classroom, the layout is essentially unchanged from American rural schools of the 1920s, which is, naturally, exactly the model the community was working from when they built this system. The teacher stands at the front near a chalkboard and a wood-burning stove or a propane heater. The students sit in rows of wooden desks with the youngest children near the front and the oldest near the back. There is no computer, no projector, no smartboard. The lessons are written on the chalkboard. The textbooks are bound volumes, often printed by Amish-owned publishing houses that produce educational materials specifically tailored to plain communities. The pages are simple, the illustrations are plain, and the content reflects the values of the world the children actually live in. Math problems involve farm calculations rather than urban scenarios. Reading passages emphasize honesty, hard work, and community. Science is taught at a basic level, covering general knowledge about plants, animals, weather, and the human body, but without much focus on the more contested areas of modern science. The teacher is, in most cases, a young woman in her late teens or early 20s, often unmarried, who has herself completed 8th grade in a similar school several years earlier. There are no education degrees here. There is no state teaching certification. The teacher's qualifications consist of her own education, her standing in the community, and the recommendation of the school board, which is made up of local parents. She's paid a modest salary, usually somewhere between $5,000 and $15,000 for the school year, with the funds raised by parent contributions and supplemented by community donations. She lives at home with her parents or boards with a local family near the school. She teaches all 8 grades in the same room, simultaneously. This last detail is the part that most modern American educators find difficult to believe. The school board itself is worth a brief mention, because it is a small piece of community government that operates entirely outside any formal legal structure. Each Amish school typically has a board of 3 or 4 parents, chosen informally by the families served by the school. The board hires the teacher, decides on the salary, handles disputes between parents and teachers, oversees building maintenance, and makes any major decisions about curriculum or scheduling. There is no state inspector, no district superintendent, no formal evaluation system, no standardized testing. The board members are not paid for their work. They serve, generally, for a few years at a time, and then rotate out to give other families a chance to participate. The whole system runs on roughly the same principles as the broader Ordnung, with local consensus replacing formal bureaucracy, and with the assumption that the parents themselves know better than any outside authority what their children need. Discipline in the classroom is handled with a directness that would surprise most modern American parents. Plain children, by the time they arrive at school, have already been taught to respect adults, to sit still, to follow instructions, and to defer to authority. A teacher does not usually need to raise her voice. A firm look or a quiet word is enough to address most minor problems. Major problems are referred to the parents, who handle them at home. The community expectation is that school behaviour and home behaviour are the same behaviour, and a child who acts out at school will hear about it at the dinner table that evening. The system depends, in the end, on the close coordination between teacher and parent, both of whom know each other personally, often attend the same church, and share the same understanding of what good behaviour looks like. There is, in this arrangement, very little of the modern American disconnect between school discipline and family discipline. The two are essentially the same thing. The way one teacher manages 30 children across 8 different grade levels is itself a small marvel of educational engineering. The classroom day is structured around rotation. The teacher works directly with one grade level for a brief period, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes, while the other grades work independently on assigned reading, written exercises, or practice problems. Then she rotates to the next grade. Older children are often expected to help younger ones, both with their schoolwork and with general behaviour. The system depends heavily on the assumption that students will work quietly and independently when not being directly taught, which, by the standards of modern public schools, sounds optimistic. In practice, it works, mostly because the children come from homes where quiet, focused work is the daily expectation. A child who cannot sit still and work independently for an hour at home is not going to suddenly develop that skill at school. The Amish home has already done much of the heavy lifting before the child walks through the classroom door. The subjects covered are kept deliberately narrow: reading, writing, arithmetic, some geography, some history, some general science. German, sometimes, as a formal subject, helping students learn to read the standard High German of the Bible and the old hymn books, which is different from the spoken Pennsylvania Dutch. Music in the form of unison singing of hymns. Art is mostly limited to penmanship and occasional simple drawing. There is no formal instruction in subjects that the community considers either irrelevant or potentially dangerous to plain life. No comparative religion, no philosophy, no literature beyond what reinforces the values of the community. No higher-level math, no advanced physics, no biology beyond the most basic level. The curriculum is, in modern American terms, somewhere around a 6th or 7th grade public school level in terms of academic intensity, although the basic skills, particularly arithmetic, are often taught with a thoroughness that produces students who can mentally calculate complex farm or business problems faster than most college graduates can do them with a calculator. The school year is shorter than a public school year, running roughly from late August or early September through mid-April, with breaks at Christmas and Easter, and several days off in late fall and early spring to accommodate planting and harvest. The shorter calendar reflects the agricultural reality of plain life. Children are needed at home for major farm activities. School is structured around the rhythm of the year, not the other way around. A boy of 12 might spend 3 days helping his father bring in the hay, and the school simply accepts that he will catch up when he returns. The teacher is flexible. The parents are responsible. The system works. When a student finishes 8th grade, which usually happens at age 14 or so, their formal schooling ends. This is the point where the plain world parts ways with mainstream American education most decisively. The community does not, in general, send its children to high school. There is no expectation of further academic study. There is no path toward college, toward professional careers, toward the kind of life that mainstream American culture treats as the default outcome of education. The end of 8th grade is treated as the end of education in the formal sense, and the beginning of education in the practical sense, where the student now learns the actual skills they will need for adult life through apprenticeship, family work, and direct experience. This right to end formal schooling at the 8th grade level is not, as you might assume, something that happened by accident. It is the result of one of the most important legal battles in the history of American religious freedom, and the case has been studied in law schools ever since. In the late 1960s, several Amish families in New Glarus, Wisconsin, were prosecuted for refusing to send their teenage children to the local public high school. The state of Wisconsin, like most states, required compulsory school attendance until age 16. The Amish families argued that high school, with its emphasis on competitive sports, science laboratories, secular literature, and exposure to mainstream American culture, would damage their children's faith and pull them away from the community. The state argued that the welfare of children required a standard education, regardless of the religious preferences of their parents. The case made its way through the state courts, and eventually to the United States Supreme Court, where it was argued in late 1971 under the name Wisconsin versus Yoder. The lead plaintiff, Jonas Yoder, was an Amish father from Wisconsin who had refused, on religious grounds, to send his 15-year-old daughter to the local high school. In May of 1972, the Supreme Court ruled, unanimously in the relevant parts, in favor of the Amish families. The decision was a sweeping affirmation of religious freedom, holding that the state's interest in compulsory education had to be balanced against the constitutional protections of the First Amendment, and that the Amish had demonstrated, through 3 centuries of stable community life, that their alternative educational system produced adults who are capable, responsible, and self-supporting. The court was particularly impressed by the evidence that Amish young people, after leaving school at 8th grade, did not become dependent on public welfare, did not commit unusual amounts of crime, and did not fail at adult life. They went to work on family farms and in family businesses, they married within their community, they paid their taxes, and they raised the next generation. The state's argument that further schooling was essential for citizenship simply did not hold up against this evidence. The ruling has been the legal foundation of Amish education ever since, and it remains one of the strongest precedents in American law for the protection of religious minority practices, even when those practices conflict with otherwise generally applicable state requirements. One small but practically important provision of the Yoder decision deserves a note. The court did not actually grant the Amish a complete exemption from compulsory education up to age 16. Instead, it allowed them to substitute their own form of vocational training for the standard high school requirement. In practice, this means that Amish teenagers between 14 and 16 are technically still enrolled in a kind of informal continuing education, even though they are working full-time on the family farm or in the family business. The community satisfies this requirement by having the parents keep a written record of the practical skills the young person is learning, the projects they are working on, and the supervised instruction they are receiving from adult mentors. The state, in turn, accepts these records as evidence that the educational obligation is being met. The arrangement is, in some ways, a quiet legal fiction, but it is one that has held up for more than 50 years, and it allows everyone involved to claim that the law is being followed without anyone actually having to attend a public high school. The reasoning behind the Amish position on schooling, beyond the legal arguments, is worth understanding on its own terms. The community does not oppose education in some general way. They are not anti-intellectual in any simple sense. The plain world includes successful business people, skilled craftsmen, expert farmers, and excellent self-taught readers who often consume more serious literature in a year than most college graduates. What the community opposes is a particular kind of education, the kind that emphasizes individual achievement, abstract academic credentials, and exposure to value systems that compete with the values of the community itself. High school, in their reading, is dangerous, not because it teaches reading and math, but because it teaches social ambition, exposure to media, romantic involvement outside the community, and a sense of self that places the individual ahead of the family and the church. College is even more dangerous. College, the bishops would say, is where young people learn to question their parents' beliefs, to argue with their religious teachers, to imagine themselves as something other than members of a small farming community. College is, in their view, the most efficient mechanism ever invented for pulling people away from a community like theirs. And so the door to college is very deliberately closed. This produces a result that startles outsiders. The plain community has essentially no professionals in the mainstream sense. There are no Amish doctors, no Amish lawyers, no Amish university professors, no Amish architects or engineers. When a plain family needs a doctor, they go to an English doctor, sometimes one their community has worked with for decades. When they need legal advice, they hire an English lawyer. When they need any professional skill that requires advanced certification, they purchase it from the outside world. The community has, in this sense, deliberately accepted that the professions are not available to them, and they have built their economy around skilled trades, farming, and small business ownership instead. The trade-off, from their perspective, is straightforward. They give up access to the prestige and income of the professions in exchange for keeping their children inside the community. Most plain families would consider this trade overwhelmingly favourable. A young man who would have in another life become an attorney making $250,000 a year is, in this life, a master cabinet maker making $60,000 and seeing his wife and children every evening at the dinner table. From inside the community, the second life is considered the better one, by a wide margin. What happens then, after 8th grade? For most plain teenagers, the answer is apprenticeship in one form or another. Boys typically begin working full-time alongside their fathers, uncles or older brothers, learning a trade through direct hands-on experience. A farm boy will spend his teenage years becoming a competent farmer. A boy from a furniture-making family will start at the bottom of the shop, sweeping floors and sorting wood, and slowly work his way up to skilled woodworking over 5 or 7 years. A boy whose family runs a construction business will start carrying boards and holding ladders, and by his early 20s he will be a skilled framer or finish carpenter. Girls follow a parallel track. They work alongside their mothers in household management, food preservation, cooking, sewing, gardening and childcare. Many girls also work in family businesses, particularly retail operations like bakeries, fabric shops, or small farm stands. Some take outside jobs as cleaners, nannies or cooks for English families, especially in the years between school and marriage. The work is real. The skills are serious. By the time a plain teenager reaches their late teens, they are functioning by any honest standard as a competent young adult with a recognizable trade or skill set and the ability to earn a living. The specific trades that are open to plain young people have expanded considerably in the last 50 years as the community has shifted away from a purely agricultural economy. Carpentry remains one of the largest trades, both for residential and commercial construction. Cabinet making and furniture making are major industries, with Amish-built furniture commanding premium prices in showrooms across the eastern United States. Welding and metalwork employ thousands of young men, particularly in the manufacture of farm equipment, sheds, and decorative ironwork. Buggy making, as we have already seen, is a specialized trade with its own apprenticeship pipeline. Harness making, leatherwork, and saddle repair support the equine economy that the buggy depends on. Quilting, baking, food preservation, and craft production employ large numbers of women, often in small home-based businesses that sell to tourists or wholesale to retail outlets. Greenhouse work, particularly the production of bedding plants and vegetable starts for spring sales, has become a major seasonal industry in Lancaster County, with Amish-run greenhouses supplying garden centres across half the country. The picture of the plain economy as purely farming is decades out of date. The modern plain economy is diversified, profitable, and increasingly sophisticated, even while remaining tightly bound to family-based work patterns. Informal mentoring is the engine that makes all of this work. A boy entering a trade does not generally sign a formal apprenticeship contract or enroll in a vocational training program. He simply starts showing up at his father's shop, or his uncle's farm, or a neighbour's construction site, and he begins to learn by doing. The senior workers teach him as they work, correcting his mistakes, demonstrating techniques, gradually trusting him with more responsibility as his skills develop. The system has no formal credential at the end of it. There is no certificate issued, no test administered, no rite of passage that says, "You are now a journeyman carpenter." The recognition comes from other workers in the trade who see what the young man can do and treat him accordingly. By the time he is 20 or 21, he might be running his own crew, having absorbed the knowledge of a craft over 7 or 8 years of direct daily practice. This is, in some sense, the original European apprenticeship model, the one that existed before formal vocational schools were invented, preserved almost intact in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. It worked for centuries in Europe, it still works here. There is also a quiet but important parallel system of informal education that runs alongside the formal schooling. Plain young people read. They read a lot. Not the kinds of books a high school English curriculum would assign, but a wide range of material drawn from community sources. Religious books are common, including not only the Bible and the hymn books, but also collections of sermons, devotional writings, and the histories of the early Anabaptists. Family magazines circulate from house to house, with names like Family Life, Young Companion, and Die Botschaft, all published by Amish-owned presses and full of news from plain communities across North America. Local newspapers are read carefully, especially the obituaries, the agricultural columns, and the local business pages. Some plain young people develop strong interests in history in particular, since history is one of the few academic subjects the community considers entirely safe. There are Amish men who can discuss the Reformation, the Revolutionary War, or the migration patterns of their own ancestors with the depth of a university-trained historian, even though they themselves have never set foot in a university classroom. The publishing industry serving the plain community is itself a small wonder. There are several major Amish-owned presses, most of them in Ohio and Indiana, producing a steady flow of books, magazines, and devotional materials specifically for plain readers. The content covers a wide range, from children's stories with strong moral lessons, to historical accounts of the early Anabaptist martyrs, to practical guides on farming, animal husbandry, and household management. The print runs are modest by mainstream standards, often a few thousand copies, but they reach virtually every plain household across North America. Subscriptions are renewed by mail. Letters from readers are printed in each issue. Births, marriages, and deaths from communities across the continent are reported. The whole system functions as a kind of slow internet, connecting scattered plain communities through paper and ink rather than fibre and signal, and producing a sense of broader plain identity that ties Lancaster to Holmes County to LaGrange to the small new settlements in Maine and Montana. The mainstream publishing industry has, by and large, no idea this parallel system exists. The community simply produces what it needs and passes it around among themselves. The end result of all of this is a community where the formal academic level is low, but the practical competence is high, where the average member has never been to high school but can run a profitable business, manage a farm, build a house, raise 8 children, read the Bible in 3 languages, and recite hymns that have been sung continuously for 4 centuries. The mainstream American reaction to this, when it is encountered for the first time, often involves a kind of intellectual whiplash. We are conditioned to associate education with credentials, and credentials with competence. The plain world detaches these things. Competence is taught directly. Credentials are not pursued. The community functions, the economy thrives, and the children grow up into adults who are, by their own standards, well prepared for the lives they will actually live. Whether this is a better system or a worse system depends entirely on what you consider education to be for. If education is preparation for participation in modern professional life, the plain system is clearly inadequate. If education is preparation for a particular way of life within a particular community, the plain system is, by most measures, remarkably effective. The language is part of why all of this holds together. As long as Pennsylvania Dutch remains the language of the home and the community, plain children grow up with a deep emotional connection to a linguistic world that the mainstream simply does not share. English is the language of business, of school, of dealings with outsiders. Pennsylvania Dutch is the language of family, of intimacy, of prayer, of jokes that only the community will understand. The two languages do different work, and they keep different worlds slightly apart from each other. Linguists who study the plain communities have noted that the survival of Pennsylvania Dutch into the 3rd century of American life is genuinely unusual, and that it appears to be one of the strongest predictors of long-term community survival. Communities where the dialect fades tend to lose their distinctiveness faster than communities where it remains strong. The plain people seem to have intuited this on their own without any academic study, which is why mothers continue to speak Deutsch to their babies, why grandparents quietly correct their grandchildren's grammar at the dinner table, and why the language has now survived almost 300 years on these green Pennsylvania hills with no signs of imminent disappearance. It is, in its quiet way, one of the most successful linguistic preservation projects in modern history, conducted entirely without funding, planning, or academic supervision, and operated by people who have no idea they are conducting it. They are just talking to each other, the way they have always talked, and the language keeps going on its own. If language is the invisible thread that holds the plain community together at the level of the kitchen table, then clothing is the visible thread that holds it together everywhere else. The moment a person from a plain background walks out their front door, what they are wearing tells the world exactly who they are, not in the loose, suggestive way that mainstream fashion sometimes signals personality or status, in a precise, decoded, almost biographical way. A trained eye looking at a plain person on a Lancaster sidewalk can read off, in about 3 seconds, their marital status, their gender, their approximate age, their church district, the specific Amish or Mennonite group they belong to, and sometimes even their occupation. The clothing is, in a very real sense, a worn document, and the rules that govern it are, like the Ordnung itself, unwritten, exact, and absolutely enforced. To understand how the plain dress code works, you have to start with the underlying principle, which is not, as outsiders often assume, anti-fashion. The plain people are not, philosophically speaking, opposed to clothing being pleasant to look at. What they are opposed to is the idea of clothing as a vehicle for individual expression. In the mainstream world, what you wear is a statement about yourself. It announces your personality, your taste, your wealth, your subculture, your aspirations, your mood that morning. The plain people consider this entire premise to be spiritually dangerous. Clothing, in their reading, should not be about you. It should mark you as a member of the community, not as an individual with distinctive preferences. The German word the bishops use for this principle is Demut, which translates roughly as humility, but means something more specific than the English word suggests. Demut is the quality of not standing out, of not seeking attention, of not placing yourself above your neighbours. The dress code exists in the end to enforce Demut. Every detail of cut, colour, and fabric is selected to produce a person who looks like every other person in their group, with no visible mark of individual ambition. For men, the basic uniform of the Old Order Amish is straightforward and almost unchanged from the 1700s. Black or dark blue trousers, plain and loose-fitting with no creases and no cuffs. A simple shirt, usually solid blue, grey or white, sometimes pale green or pale lavender, but never patterned and never bright. Suspenders rather than a belt, because belts are considered slightly worldly. A plain dark vest for cooler weather or for Sunday services. A black wool coat for the cold months. The trousers fasten with buttons rather than zippers, which the older bishops considered too modern when zippers first appeared in the early 1900s, although the more recent communities have quietly relaxed this rule for everyday work pants. Suit jackets, when worn, have hooks and eyes rather than buttons or zippers on the front closure. A detail that traces back to the original split with the broader Mennonite community and remains a marker of strict Old Order identity. The hat is its own essential element. Adult Amish men wear black felt hats with a flat brim during the cooler months, and woven straw hats with a similar flat brim during the warmer months. The exact width of the brim, the depth of the crown, and the angle of the dent in the top all carry small but recognisable meanings. A Lancaster Old Order man wears a brim about 3.5 inches wide. A man from a more conservative community might wear a wider brim. A young unbaptized boy might wear a slightly different shape until he joins the church. The hat is removed indoors, set carefully on a hook or a shelf near the door, and put back on as soon as the man steps outside. It is not a fashion accessory. It is the visible top of a complete uniform that says, "Here is a member of the church," dressed exactly as a member of the church should be dressed. Then there is the beard, which is one of the most carefully regulated features of plain male appearance, and one of the most easily misread by outsiders. An Amish man does not grow a beard until he is married. A bachelor is clean-shaven, even into his late 20s or 30s if he remains unmarried. The day after his wedding, he stops shaving his chin and begins to grow a beard, which he will then wear for the rest of his life. The beard grows in fully and is trimmed only enough to keep it tidy, never shaped into a fashionable style. Crucially, the upper lip is kept clean-shaven. No moustache. Ever. The reason for this prohibition traces back several centuries to a time when moustaches were associated with European military officers. The Anabaptists, as committed pacifists, did not want to look like soldiers. They removed the moustache as a permanent visual statement of their non-resistance, and the rule has been faithfully maintained for over 300 years. To this day, a man with a full beard and no moustache is almost certainly plain. The combination is so distinctive that it functions as an instant identifier in any setting where it might appear. This means that for a married Amish man, his face itself is a public document. Anyone looking at him knows immediately that he is married. They also know from the length and greyness of the beard, roughly how long he has been married and roughly how old he is. A short, dark beard suggests a man in his late 20s. A medium-length brown beard suggests a man in his 30s or early 40s. A long grey-streaked beard suggests a man in his 50s or beyond. A pure white beard reaching nearly to the chest signals a respected elder, often a bishop or minister. The beard is not just decoration, it is biography. And the absence of a beard, on a man clearly past the age of 20, signals just as clearly that this person is single. For women, the dress code is even more comprehensive and even more carefully encoded. The basic garment is the long dress, which extends well below the knee and is made of solid-coloured fabric. The colours permitted vary slightly by community, but generally include dark blue, dark green, dark purple, burgundy, grey, brown, and sometimes black. Pastels are sometimes allowed for younger women in some communities. Bright colours are forbidden. Patterns are forbidden in the strictest groups, although the Mennonite communities permit small floral prints and conservative calico patterns. The dress is worn over a slip and undergarments, and it is paired with a matching cape that covers the bodice and an apron that covers the lower half of the dress. The cape and apron are usually made from the same fabric as the dress, and they fasten with straight pins rather than buttons in the strictest Old Order communities, which is the kind of detail that startles outsiders the first time they hear about it. The pins are tiny, secure, and have been the standard fastener for plain women's clothing for centuries. The head covering is, for a plain woman, perhaps the most theologically important item of clothing she wears. The practice traces directly back to a passage in the New Testament, in the first letter to the Corinthians, where the Apostle Paul instructs women to cover their heads while praying. The plain communities read this instruction literally and continuously. Plain women cover their heads at all times when they are awake, with very rare exceptions, from young childhood until the day they die. The exact style of the covering varies by community and by region, and the variations themselves are full of meaning. The Lancaster Old Order Amish woman wears, on workdays, a small white organdy or muslin prayer covering, sometimes called a cap, which sits on the back of the head and ties under the chin with white ribbons. The shape is heart-like, narrow at the back and curved slightly forward at the temples, and it is worn over hair that has been parted in the middle and pulled back into a tight bun. Over the cap, for outdoor wear or formal occasions, an additional black bonnet is sometimes worn, providing protection from sun, wind, and rain. The shape, size, and exact construction of the cap varies meaningfully between communities. A Lancaster cap is recognisably different from a Holmes County cap, which is different from a Napanee cap. The differences are small, often just a matter of a 1/4 inch here or a slight curve there, but they are immediately readable by anyone trained to look. A travelling Amish woman walking through an unfamiliar town can be identified by her cap shape as belonging to a specific home community. Strangers approach her differently because of it. Conversations begin with the right reference points. The cap is, in this sense, the female equivalent of the buggy roof colour, marking community membership with quiet precision. Married Amish women in some communities wear a black bonnet over the cap for church services and formal events. The black bonnet, sometimes called a heart bonnet because of its shape, indicates marital status in much the same way that a beard does for men. An unmarried young woman wears the cap but not the black bonnet. A married woman adds it. A widow in some communities returns to wearing only the cap, or wears a different style of bonnet that signals her widowhood. The shifts are subtle. The information conveyed is not. Anyone meeting a plain woman for the first time can read her marital status from her head covering before any conversation even begins, which is, depending on your perspective, either remarkably efficient or remarkably invasive. Mennonite women's dress codes are similar in principle, but milder in execution. Conservative Mennonite groups still require head coverings, often a small white veil that sits on the back of the head with no chin ties. The dresses can be made from patterned fabrics like small floral prints, which the Amish would consider too decorative. The colours are slightly broader. Hairstyles are slightly more flexible, although a tight bun is still the standard for most groups. Moderate Mennonites have, in many cases, abandoned the head covering entirely or wear only a small symbolic version. The whole gradient we discussed earlier, running from the strictest Old Order Amish through to the most modern Mennonites, plays out in clothing just as clearly as it does in technology. The further to the modern end of the spectrum a community sits, the more individual variation it permits in dress. The closer to the traditional end, the more uniform the appearance. There are smaller markers too, that carry community-specific meanings. The single suspender we already mentioned, worn by Byler Amish men, where most other Amish men wear too. The slight difference in shirt colour preferences, where some communities favour a particular shade of blue that becomes a quiet signal. The presence or absence of a small inside pocket on a man's jacket. The exact knot used to tie a woman's apron at the back. The thickness of the ribbon on the cap. Every one of these details is settled by community tradition, taught from mother to daughter or father to son, and read fluently by everyone in the broader plain world. To an outsider, all plain women look essentially identical. To a plain person, the variations are obvious, and they carry the same kind of social information that a wedding ring, a uniform, or a school colours might carry in mainstream life. One more piece of the dress code deserves a careful note, because it is the absence of something rather than the presence of it. Plain people do not wear jewellery. No earrings, no necklaces, no bracelets, and, perhaps most strikingly, no wedding rings. The plain community considers all of these items to be ornaments, and ornaments, by definition, are about drawing attention to the individual. A wedding ring announces a fact about the person, but it also serves a decorative function, and decoration is the problem. The plain response is simply to not have any. Marital status is communicated through other means, through the beard, through the head covering, through the prayer cap, through the simple fact that everyone in the community already knows everyone else's marital status because the community is small and tightly connected. There is no need for a ring, because there is nobody who needs to be informed. The information is already in the room. This raises an interesting question that outsiders often ask. Without a wedding ring, how does a plain married person signal their married status to strangers? The honest answer is that they generally do not need to. The plain community does not, by and large, interact romantically with strangers. The context in which a person might want to signal availability or commitment, such as bars, social mixers, dating apps, or workplace flirtations, simply do not exist in plain life. Marriages happen within the community, between people who have known each other since childhood, often introduced through family connections at youth gatherings. The whole apparatus of stranger-based courtship that wedding rings are designed to support is not part of the plain world. The ring would solve a problem the community does not have. Children's clothing follows the same principles as adult clothing, in slightly miniature form. Plain boys wear smaller versions of their father's clothing, with the same dark trousers, the same suspenders, the same plain shirts, the same hats. Plain girls wear dresses, head coverings, and aprons in styles that match the women of their community, scaled down for their age. The transition from childhood to adulthood, in clothing terms, is not marked by any sudden change. Children grow gradually into the adult uniform. The clothing they wear at 5 looks essentially like the clothing they will wear at 35, just slightly larger. There is no equivalent of the modern American teenage explosion of self-expression through fashion. The clothes are the clothes. They were the clothes when you were 5. They will be the clothes when you are 80. The continuity is part of the point. All of this clothing is, in most plain households, made at home. The women of the community sew, and they sew with skill that would put most professional tailors to shame. A plain woman in her 30s has probably made hundreds of dresses for herself, her daughters, and her sons. She has stitched suspenders, hemmed pants, and turned out winter coats for an entire family. The fabric is purchased at one of the local plain-owned fabric stores, which stock exactly the colours and weights that the community uses, in solid colours that mainstream fabric stores would have a hard time supplying. The patterns are passed from mother to daughter, often without any written record, just by direct teaching at the sewing machine. The sewing machines themselves are, like most plain machinery, operated by alternative power, either treadle-powered or driven by compressed air. A modern Amish woman's sewing room, with its racks of solid-coloured fabric, its rows of carefully labelled threads, and its hand-cranked or air-driven machine, looks almost identical to what such a room would have looked like 100 years ago, except for the propane lighting overhead and the occasional LED task light powered by a battery. The cumulative effect of all of this, when you encounter it in person, is something genuinely striking. A plain church service, with 300 or 400 people gathered in a barn or a meeting house, presents a visual unity that mainstream American gatherings simply cannot match. Every man is dressed almost identically to every other man. Every woman is dressed almost identically to every other woman. The colours of the room are the dark blues and greys and blacks of the standard plain palette, broken only by the white of the prayer coverings and the pale yellows and creams of the older buildings themselves, the eye looking out over the congregation. It sees no logos, no slogans, no name brands, no fashion statements, no signals of individual wealth or taste. It sees instead a community. And that is, in the end, exactly the point. The dress code does not just produce uniformity, it produces a visible, walking statement of belonging. When a plain person looks at another plain person, they do not see a stranger. They see a brother or sister, dressed in the same uniform, marked by the same signs, ready to be recognized and welcomed as one of their own. That feeling of belonging is what underlies the second major feature of plain life we should examine, which is the economic system. Because if the clothing tells you who someone is, the economy tells you what they can count on. And what plain people can count on from each other, when things go wrong, is something that the surrounding American economy simply cannot replicate, no matter how many insurance products it invents. When a plain person experiences a serious misfortune, the response is, by mainstream standards, almost unbelievable. Consider a barn fire, which is one of the most common catastrophes in any farming community. A lightning strike, an electrical short in a hayloft, a heat lamp that tipped over in a calf pen, any of these can ignite a barn full of dry hay and reduce a critical piece of farm infrastructure to ashes in a matter of hours. For a non-plain farmer, the response to a barn fire involves calling the insurance company, filing claims, waiting for an adjuster, getting estimates from contractors, and rebuilding over a period of months with substantial out-of-pocket costs, even when the policy covers most of the damage. For a plain farmer, the response is different. By the morning after the fire, neighbours have already begun arriving. By the end of the week, a new barn has been framed. By the end of the month, the new barn is standing where the old one used to be, often larger and better designed than the original, paid for by a combination of community contributions and donated labour. The whole event becomes, in a strange way, a celebration of the community itself. The tradition that makes this possible is called the barn raising, and it is one of the most photographed and least understood features of plain life. When a family needs a major building project completed, particularly a barn or a large outbuilding, the community organises a single intensive day of collective labour. Word goes out a few weeks in advance. On the appointed morning, sometimes 100 or more men arrive at the site, often before sunrise. They bring their own tools, their own ladders, and in some cases their own packed lunches, although the host family typically provides the main meal of the day. The work is organised by a few experienced builders who serve as informal foremen. Frames are pre-cut and ready to assemble, Materials are stacked in the order they will be needed. The men work in coordinated teams, raising walls, setting trusses, nailing siding, laying shingles. By the end of the day, a structure that would have taken a regular construction crew several weeks to complete is essentially finished. The shingles might still need to be touched up the following week, and the interior fittings will be added over the next month or two, but the building itself is standing, weathertight, and ready for use. The barn raising is not, strictly speaking, free. The host family is expected to provide food, drink, and good fellowship throughout the day. They are also expected, in the broader sense, to participate in the raisings of other families when called upon to do so. The whole system runs on a slow, generation-long exchange of labour, in which every family eventually receives help when they need it, and gives help when others need it. The accounting is not done formally. Nobody keeps a ledger of hours worked or favours owed. The expectation is simply that everyone participates when they can, and that participation builds up a kind of communal credit that protects each family from any individual catastrophe. A plain farmer who has shown up at a dozen barn raisings over 20 years has, in effect, paid the premium on a remarkable kind of insurance policy. When his own barn burns, the policy pays out immediately, in the form of dozens of skilled neighbours with hammers. The smaller version of the same system is called a frolic, which, despite the cheerful name, is a serious work event. A frolic is any gathering where neighbours come together to help with a major task that is too big for one family to handle alone. There are quilting frolics, where a group of women complete a quilt in a single afternoon that would have taken one woman months. There are butchering frolics, where families combine to slaughter and process pigs or cattle in the fall. There are work frolics for clearing fields, repairing fences, painting houses, harvesting tobacco, or canning hundreds of jars of vegetables for the winter. The frolic is the smaller, more frequent cousin of the barn raising, and it serves the same basic function. The labour of many neighbours, freely given, replaces what mainstream society would handle through hired workers, contractors, or commercial services. The economics behind a barn raising, when calculated, are remarkable. A new dairy barn of the kind common in Lancaster County, with 2 levels, room for 40 milking cows, hay storage, and an attached milk house, would cost a non-plain farmer somewhere between $300,000 and $500,000 to construct using hired contractors. The same building, raised by the community on a single day with donated labour and significantly reduced material markups, often costs the host family less than $100,000 in actual cash outlay. The labour itself, if it were priced at standard construction rates, would be worth tens of thousands of dollars on its own. None of that labour enters the cash economy, none of it is reported to any tax authority, none of it generates a paycheck. It is simply given, neighbour to neighbour, with the understanding that it will be returned in kind whenever the giver eventually needs help in turn. The plain community has, in this sense, preserved a form of economic exchange that almost vanished from the modern world a century ago. Beyond the labour exchange, the plain community has developed a parallel financial system that mirrors, in informal ways, the services that mainstream banks and insurance companies provide. There are several plain-affiliated mutual aid organisations that operate in practical terms like community insurance funds. One of the largest, often referred to simply as the Amish Helping Hand or by various community-specific names, collects contributions from member households and pays out support when needs arise. A family with a major medical bill can apply for assistance from the fund. A family that has lost a breadwinner can receive ongoing support. A family wanting to start a small business can sometimes receive low-interest loans at terms far more generous than any commercial lender would offer. The fund is run by trusted community members, often deacons or retired bishops, with minimal overhead and essentially no profit motive. It is not, in legal terms, an insurance company. It does not file with state regulators. It does not produce annual reports. But it operates with remarkable effectiveness, and it has been doing so for decades. Medical care is one of the largest expenses that plain families face, and it is handled with a combination of community support and direct negotiation with hospitals. Plain people, in general, do not carry conventional health insurance. They pay for medical care in cash, which gives them substantial negotiating leverage with hospitals and doctors. When a plain family needs a major procedure, the head of the family or a community representative will often sit down with the hospital billing office and negotiate the cash price for the service in advance. The discount can be substantial, sometimes 30 to 50% below the price that would be billed to an insurance company. Hospitals are generally willing to provide these discounts because cash payment eliminates the administrative overhead of insurance billing, which is, depending on how the hospital is structured, surprisingly expensive. The plain family pays less, the hospital receives faster payment, and the whole transaction is settled with a check or a wire transfer instead of years of insurance claim processing. Elder care follows the same general principle. Plain people, by and large, do not move to nursing homes or retirement communities. When parents reach the age where they cannot easily live on their own, they typically move into a small addition built onto the home of one of their adult children. These additions, often called grossdaddy houses, which translates roughly as grandfather houses, are essentially small attached apartments designed for older relatives. The grandparents live independently in their own space, with their own kitchen and sitting room, but they are physically connected to the larger family home and can take meals with the family, help with childcare, and remain part of daily life. When health declines and more direct care is needed, the family provides it. Hired help is occasionally brought in for particularly demanding cases, but the default assumption is that family members will care for their elderly parents at home, supported by the broader community when needed. The plain community essentially has no equivalent of the modern nursing home, and the prospect of placing an elderly parent into one is, for most plain families, almost unthinkable. The decision about which child houses the grandparents is itself worth noting, because it follows a tradition that has remained remarkably stable. In most plain communities, the youngest son and his family inherit the original homestead, and the parents move into a grossdaddy addition built onto the same property. The older sons and daughters have by that point generally established their own farms or businesses elsewhere, often within a few miles. The youngest son takes over the home farm gradually, sharing the workload with his father in his teens and 20s, fully managing the operation by his 30s, and providing the housing arrangement that allows his parents to age in place. The pattern is not absolute. Some families adjust based on which adult child has the most suitable property or the strongest relationship with the parents. But the general expectation is clear, and it produces a continuity of generational connection that mainstream American family life largely abandoned several decades ago. A plain child grows up with grandparents in the next room. A plain grandparent dies in the home where they raised their children, surrounded by the great-grandchildren they helped to feed. This whole network of mutual aid is the legal foundation for one of the most unusual features of plain financial life. In 1965, when the United States passed the Medicare law and expanded Social Security, the Amish community formally petitioned the federal government for an exemption. They argued, accurately, that they had been providing for their own elderly, disabled, and unemployed members for centuries, that they did not want to participate in government welfare programs, and that the religious principle of community self-sufficiency was at the core of their faith. After several years of negotiation, Congress passed a specific exemption in 1965, codified later in additional legislation, that allowed members of religious groups with established traditions of mutual aid to opt out of Social Security and Medicare payroll taxes. The exemption applies only to self-employed individuals and members of qualifying religious groups. Amish people who work for themselves or for other Amish employers do not pay into Social Security, do not pay Medicare taxes, and do not receive benefits from either program. The community handles all of these needs internally, through the mutual aid networks we have just described. The arrangement has been controversial at various points over the years, with critics arguing that it allows the Amish to avoid taxes that everyone else has to pay. The community's response is that they are not avoiding any obligation, but rather meeting the same obligation through their own internal systems rather than through government programs. They still pay income taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, and most other forms of taxation. They simply do not participate in the specific federal programs that provide retirement, disability, and medical insurance, because they consider these to be the responsibility of the family and the church. The arrangement has held up legally for 60 years, and it remains one of the most distinctive features of plain economic life in the United States. It is one of the very few cases in which a religious community has been formally recognized by the federal government as having an economic system that operates outside the standard welfare state, and it has done so by demonstrating generation after generation that it can actually do what it claims to do. The plain community takes care of its own. The Social Security exemption is the law's acknowledgement that this care is real, ongoing, and effective. What this all amounts to is a community where the financial logic of mainstream society has been quietly replaced by something different. Insurance is replaced by neighbours with hammers. Banking is replaced by community lending. Health insurance is replaced by cash negotiation and mutual aid. Nursing homes are replaced by attached grandparent apartments. Retirement plans are replaced by the assumption that you will be cared for, in old age, by the children you raised and by the church you served. The system works because everyone participates in it, because everyone trusts it, and because everyone knows that they themselves will eventually need it. The plain economy, in the end, is built not on money, but on a much older and stranger foundation. It is built on the assumption that the people around you will be there when you need them, and that you will be there for them in return. It is, by every measure of efficiency and effectiveness, one of the most successful insurance schemes ever devised, and it has been operating quietly on the back roads of America for almost 300 years. All of the structures we have walked through so far, the language, the schoolhouse, the dress code, the mutual aid networks, the unwritten constitution carried in the heart, eventually reach a single point in every plain person's life where the question becomes personal. Will I actually stay? The answer to that question is not assumed. It is not enforced. It is, in one of the more remarkable features of plain culture, deliberately put to each young person, and the community accepts whatever answer comes back. The structured period in which this decision happens is called Rumspringa, and it is, depending on how you look at it, either one of the most generous gestures any traditional culture extends to its children, or one of the most carefully designed retention mechanisms in the modern world. Possibly both. The word Rumspringa comes from Pennsylvania Dutch and means, roughly, running around. The concept is straightforward in outline, even if it is endlessly complicated in detail. At about age 16, a plain young person transitions from childhood into a new stage of life. They are not yet baptized as members of the church. The Ordnung, technically, does not apply to them in the same way it applies to adults. They are still living at home, still attending family church services, still working in the family business. But the formal expectations of strict plain conduct are relaxed, and the young person is given a period of years in which they can explore what life outside the community might look like, before deciding whether to commit themselves permanently to plain life through adult baptism. The reason this practice exists is theological rather than practical. The plain communities believe, drawing on the same Anabaptist principles we have discussed throughout, that genuine faith requires genuine choice. A person cannot be a real member of the church if they have been forced into membership. They have to choose, freely, as a competent adult, with full knowledge of what they are choosing and what they are giving up. Infant baptism was rejected, you may recall, precisely because it made membership automatic rather than chosen. To preserve the principle of voluntary church membership, the community has to give young people a real opportunity to consider the alternative. Rumspringa is that opportunity. It is in some sense the operating system that keeps the entire theological structure of plain life consistent. Without it, the community would be in the same position as the state churches their ancestors rejected 5 centuries ago. The way Rumspringa actually plays out varies enormously by community and by individual. The popular image, fed by various reality television shows and sensational documentaries, suggests that Rumspringa is a period of wild abandon, with Amish teenagers driving sports cars, attending raves, and experimenting with whatever the modern world has to offer. The reality is, in most cases, much milder. The majority of Rumspringa-age young people in Lancaster County continue to live at home, continue to dress plain, and continue to participate in family and community life much as they always have. What changes is the social scene. The young people, freed from the strict supervision of childhood, now belong to youth groups called gangs, which is a slightly confusing term that does not mean what it sounds like. A plain gang is essentially a peer cohort, a group of young people who socialise together, attend Sunday afternoon singings together, go to weddings together, and gradually pair off into romantic relationships within the group. Each gang has its own informal identity, and the gangs themselves range across the entire spectrum of what is acceptable in Rumspringa. At one end are the conservative gangs, often called Amish gangs, even though all gangs are technically Amish, where the young people stick close to plain conventions and use their teenage years mostly for supervised social activities like volleyball games, Sunday singings, and chaperoned outings. At the other end are the wild gangs, sometimes openly nicknamed with phrases that suggest a livelier approach, where young people experiment with English clothing, English music, cars, parties, and the various forms of recreation that mainstream American teenagers consider normal. Most young people fall somewhere in the middle. They might wear English clothes when they go out on Saturday night, drive a borrowed car for a year or two, attend country music concerts, and otherwise dip a careful toe into the surrounding culture before pulling back. Most do not stray very far. The car question, in particular, has a quiet history that is worth a brief detour. A small number of Rumspringa-age young men in Lancaster County will buy used cars during their running around years, often with money saved from their first jobs. The cars are not kept on the family property generally, but parked at the home of a sympathetic English neighbour or in a rented spot at a local farm. The young man uses the car for evening trips to towns outside the community, sometimes to drive a girlfriend on a date, sometimes to attend events that would be impractical by buggy. When the time comes for baptism, the car has to go. Almost without exception, the young man sells it, gives it away, or quietly puts it up on blocks. The car is a symbol of the wider world, and stepping into the church means leaving that symbol behind. There are documented stories of young men driving their cars to the spot where they will sell them, with their fathers waiting nearby in a buggy to drive them home. The car gets handed over, the cash gets pocketed, the buggy carries the young man back to the life he has chosen. It is, in its small way, one of the more moving scenes in plain culture, and it happens in some form dozens of times every fall as the November baptism season approaches. The youth gathering, called the Singing, is the central social institution of Rumspringa, and it is where most plain young people first meet the person they will eventually marry. Singings happen on Sunday evenings, often hosted by the same family that hosted the morning church service, in the same large room where the benches still stand. The young people, both men and women, gather in the late afternoon, share a simple supper, and then sing hymns together for a couple of hours. The hymns are different from the slow, ancient hymns of the morning service. They are faster, livelier, often in English rather than German, and they are sung in unison by a room full of teenagers in their plain Sunday clothes. After the singing, the young people stay for several more hours, talking, eating, playing games, walking outside in pairs. The whole event is supervised in a loose, gentle way by the host parents, but the supervision is largely about keeping things safe rather than enforcing strict behaviour. The singing is the public part of the courtship process. By the time young people pair off, they have spent dozens or hundreds of evenings together in these settings, gradually getting to know each other in a way that feels both casual and serious at the same time. Romantic relationships during Rumspringa develop slowly and quietly by the standards of mainstream American teenage life. There is no equivalent of formal dating, with restaurant dinners and movie nights and dating apps. The standard form of courtship is the buggy ride. A young man, after a singing, asks a young woman if he might drive her home in his courting buggy. If she agrees, they leave together in the small open carriage that we discussed earlier, with 2 seats and no covered top. The ride home might take an hour or 2, even though her actual house is only a few miles away, because the point of the ride is the conversation, not the destination. Over the following months, the young couple might ride home together every Sunday after the singing, and gradually arrange to see each other on other evenings as well, sometimes meeting at her parents' kitchen table after the family has gone to bed, for hours of quiet conversation conducted in low voices over a pot of tea. The community has, over generations, developed a delicate set of conventions around this courtship process that allow young couples plenty of unsupervised time together while maintaining a strong expectation of restraint and respect. The conventions are sometimes called bundling in older accounts, although the practice has evolved considerably and varies by community. The basic idea is that the young couple spends extended time alone, but with clear understandings about what is and is not acceptable, and with the knowledge that any serious breach of these understandings will quickly become public knowledge in a community where everyone knows everyone. The system depends on personal honour more than physical chaperoning, and by all measures it works remarkably well. The rate of premarital pregnancy in the Old Order Amish community remains lower than in mainstream America, and the rate of divorce after marriage is, by some estimates, lower than 1%. The courtship system, slow and quiet and deeply embedded in community supervision, produces marriages that, on average, last. When a couple decides to marry, the announcement is made in church, usually in the late summer or early fall, and the wedding itself takes place in November, which is the traditional wedding season for plain communities. The reason for the seasonal timing is practical. The harvest is finished. The fields are quiet. The community has time. A plain wedding is not a small event. The guest list typically runs to between 200 and 400 people, including not just immediate family but extended family across multiple generations, neighbours, church members, and friends from other communities who have come for the occasion. The ceremony itself is held in the bride's family home or in a barn on the family property, with church benches set up to accommodate the crowd. The service can run 3 to 4 hours, with sermons, scripture readings, and an extended marriage vow that emphasises the lifelong, indissoluble nature of the commitment. After the ceremony, the entire crowd is fed at long tables, in multiple seatings, with food prepared by women of the community over the preceding days. The whole event can run from morning until well into the evening, and it is one of the largest community celebrations in plain life. The newlywed couple spends their first months of marriage visiting relatives, often staying for several days with each set of family before moving on to the next, in a slow tour that introduces the new spouse to the broader family network and reinforces the connections between extended kin. There is no traditional honeymoon in the mainstream sense. The couple does not go away to a tropical resort. They go around to all of their relatives, sleeping in spare rooms and sharing meals, and helping with whatever work happens to be in progress. By the time this visiting period ends, often a couple of months later, the new couple has been formally welcomed into every household that matters to them, and they have established themselves as a married unit within the community. During this visiting period, the couple is also gradually accumulating the practical foundation of their household. Each family they visit typically sends them off with gifts of household goods, sometimes substantial ones: a handmade quilt from an aunt, a set of dishes from a grandmother, a piece of furniture from the bride's father, practical tools and equipment from the groom's brothers. By the end of the tour, the couple has acquired most of what they will need to set up housekeeping in their first home, often without having to purchase very much in the cash economy. The system is, in this sense, another quiet example of the mutual aid principle we discussed in earlier chapters, applied at the scale of a new marriage. The community essentially equips its young couples for life through a slow distribution of gifts and hand-me-downs that begins at the wedding and continues for months after. The wedding meal itself is worth a brief description, because it is one of the more impressive feats of community catering anywhere in rural America. The bride's family typically begins preparing food a week or two in advance. Dozens of women from the local community arrive in the days before the wedding to help with the work. The menu, while it varies slightly by region, traditionally includes roast chicken or sometimes roast beef, mashed potatoes, several kinds of vegetables, applesauce, dinner rolls, multiple desserts, and a special wedding dish often called roast, a savoury bread and chicken stuffing that is considered essential to a proper Lancaster County wedding. The food is served in multiple seatings throughout the day, with the youngest guests in the wedding party eating first, and the rest of the crowd cycling through long tables set up in the house, the barn, or temporary tents on the property. Estimates suggest that a typical Lancaster wedding produces and serves enough food to feed several hundred people 2 full meals across the course of the day. The clean-up naturally is also handled by the community, with women returning the kitchen to order long after the guests have gone home and the new couple has begun their visiting tour. Before any of this can happen, however, the young person must make the decision that Rumspringa exists to enable. They must, sometime in their late teens or early 20s, choose to be baptized as a member of the church. The baptism is, in the plain tradition, the moment when a person formally commits to live by the ordnung for the rest of their life. It is also the moment after which leaving the church carries the consequence of formal shunning, which we discussed in earlier chapters. The decision is therefore taken with serious deliberation. A young person preparing for baptism attends a series of instruction sessions with the bishop, called the proving classes, over several months. The instruction covers the basic doctrines of the faith, the history of the Anabaptist tradition, and the specific expectations of the ordnung in the local district. At the end of the instruction, the candidate is asked whether they freely and willingly accept these obligations. If they answer yes, the bishop baptizes them at a Sunday service, pouring water over their head while they kneel, and the community welcomes them as a full member. The vast majority of plain young people, when they reach this decision point, choose to stay. The retention rate in the Lancaster Old Order Amish community is somewhere between 80 and 90%, depending on which generation you measure and which specific districts you include. This is, by any honest standard, an astonishing number. Mainstream American religious denominations would consider themselves wildly successful if they retained even a third of their teenagers into adult church membership. The plain community routinely retains more than 4 out of 5. The question that outsiders inevitably ask is why. Given the apparent strictness of plain life, given the rich and varied alternatives available in the modern world, given the explicit permission these young people receive to explore those alternatives during Rumspringa, why do so many of them choose to come back? The answer, when you talk to plain people who have made that choice themselves, is usually some version of the same thing. They look at the alternatives and they prefer what they have at home. The freedom of the modern world, the access to entertainment and travel and consumer goods, the absence of strict community expectations, all of this looks attractive in the abstract, but up close, particularly during the Rumspringa period when young people actually experience it, the mainstream world tends to feel lonely. The friendships are shallower. The romantic relationships are more chaotic. The sense of community is diluted across so many different relationships that none of them carries much weight. The work is often interesting but isolating. The freedom is real, but it comes with the burden of having to construct by yourself the entire structure of meaning and belonging that the plain community simply provides as a default. Most young people, after a year or two of experimenting, decide they prefer the default. The minority who decide to leave face a difficult path. Leaving before baptism is, in most communities, treated relatively gently. The person is not formally shunned, and they can usually maintain relationships with their family, even if those relationships become more distant over time. Leaving after baptism is much harder. A baptized member who leaves the church is, in the strictest old order communities, placed under the ban, and the social consequences extend across daily life. Even in milder communities, there is significant emotional cost on both sides. The leaver loses access to most of the social fabric they grew up in. The family loses a member who they had hoped would stay. Both sides experience genuine grief. There are people who leave anyway. Some of them go on to build successful lives in the mainstream world, becoming teachers, business owners, even occasionally academics who study the communities they left. Others struggle, particularly with the loss of the community supports we discussed earlier. A small number, after a few years away, eventually return, confess to the church, accept the discipline of reinstatement, and resume plain life. The community welcomes them back, although the path of reconciliation can be slow. There is a small but growing network of organizations that support people who have left the plain community, sometimes called ex-Amish networks. These groups, often led by former members themselves, provide practical help with the transition to mainstream life, including assistance with obtaining driver's licenses, opening bank accounts, applying to community colleges for adult education, and navigating the bureaucratic complexity of a world that the leaver was never trained to navigate. The work is quiet but meaningful, and it has expanded considerably over the last 2 decades as more former members have become willing to talk publicly about their experiences. The existence of these networks does not by itself change the overall pattern. The leavers remain a small minority, but for those who do go, the path is somewhat less lonely than it used to be. The substance use that sometimes makes Rumspringa famous in tabloid coverage is, in the great majority of cases, milder than the popular imagination suggests, but it is not nothing. A small percentage of young people during their running around years do experiment with alcohol and less commonly with various recreational substances. The community's response to this varies. Most parents would prefer that their children not engage in any of it. Most parents also recognize that this is precisely the period during which young people are supposed to encounter the temptations of the outside world and decide what they think of them. The community generally tolerates a certain amount of mild misbehavior during Rumspringa, as long as it does not escalate into something serious or become public in a way that brings shame on the family. Young people who develop genuine substance problems are usually pulled back into the family with the same kind of intensive support and care that the community would offer in any other crisis. Treatment is sometimes arranged, often through specialized clinics that work with plain communities. The goal, always, is to recover the young person rather than to punish them. A young person who comes through a substance struggle and chooses, at the end of it, to join the church, is welcomed with particular warmth. The community does not, in general, hold the Rumspringa years against anyone once they have made the commitment to plain life. The whole point of Rumspringa is to give young people the freedom to fail and to recover, and the community is, in this sense, surprisingly forgiving about what happens during that period. All of which brings us at last to the one story that almost every outsider has heard about the Plain community, and the one that demonstrates more clearly than any other what Plain life actually looks like when the rest of the world is watching. The story took place on October 2nd, 2006, in a small Amish community called Nickel Mines, in the southern part of Lancaster County. The details of the tragedy itself are well documented and serious. A man with no connection to the Amish community entered the West Nickel Mines School, a small one-room Amish schoolhouse, much like the ones we described earlier in this story, and committed an act of violence that killed 5 young Amish girls and wounded several others before taking his own life. The motive remains, in the standard sense, unknown, although the man left behind notes suggesting personal grievances that had nothing to do with the community he attacked. The response of the Amish community in the hours and days that followed is what made this story echo around the world, in a way that almost no other story from a Plain community ever has. Within hours of the shooting, while parents in the community were still in the early shock of having lost their children, members of the community began visiting the family of the shooter, not with threats, not with accusations, with expressions of forgiveness, with offers of support, and with the request that the shooter's family be allowed to grieve as well. An Amish grandfather of one of the murdered girls reportedly spent more than an hour at the shooter's father's bedside, holding the man's hand while he wept, telling him that the community held no anger toward his family. When donations began pouring in from across the country to support the victims, the Amish community quietly insisted that some of those funds be directed to the shooter's widow and her 3 young children, who had also lost their husband and father that day. The widow was eventually invited to the funerals of the girls her husband had killed. She attended. The community welcomed her. This response was, for many people watching from outside the community, almost incomprehensible. The cultural assumption in modern America is that grief should produce anger, that anger should produce demands for justice, that the family of a perpetrator carries a kind of inherited guilt for what their loved one has done. The Amish response inverted every one of these assumptions. The grief was real. The anger, by all accounts, was simply not there, or at least not in the dominant way that mainstream observers expected. The forgiveness was extended within hours, before the bodies were even buried. The shooter's family was treated not as adjacent to the crime, but as additional victims of it, and the community, having stated its position, simply went forward into the long work of grieving its own losses without further public comment. The schoolhouse where the shooting occurred was demolished by the community in the days that followed. A new schoolhouse, called New Hope, was built nearby on a different site, and Amish children returned to school within weeks. The pasture where the old schoolhouse stood was eventually returned to grass, with no memorial marker, no plaque, and no permanent indication of what had happened there. The community decided, collectively, that they did not want to turn the site into a place of pilgrimage or commemoration. The girls would be remembered in the hearts of their families and in the quiet daily prayers of the community. The site itself would be allowed to rest. In the years that followed, the relationship between the Amish community and the family of the shooter continued in ways that surprised journalists who came back to check on the story. The shooter's widow remained in contact with several of the Amish families who had lost daughters. There were occasional visits. There were birthday cards sent quietly across the years. The shooter's mother eventually became a regular caregiver for one of the surviving girls who had suffered serious injuries in the attack, spending many hours over many years helping with the demanding work of long-term recovery. None of this was done for publicity. The community did not seek attention for any of it, and the families involved generally declined to discuss the relationship in detail with outsiders. The story simply continued quietly, in the way that Plain stories tend to continue, with care extended across the line of grievous wrong, generation after generation, without much announcement. The forgiveness offered at Nickel Mines was not, as some commentators suggested at the time, a sudden act of saintly heroism. It was the natural expression of a way of life that had been preparing for that moment for almost 500 years. The principle of forgiveness toward enemies was not invented on October 2nd, 2006. It was applied on that day, in the hardest possible circumstance, by a community that had been practicing it daily for generations. The teaching traces straight back to the New Testament instructions to love your enemies, to pray for those who persecute you, to forgive 70 times 7. The community had been singing those words at every Sunday service for centuries. The stories of Dirk Willems and the other Anabaptist martyrs we discussed in the early chapters had been read and reread in plain households for generations. The expectation that, when grievous wrong was done to you, the correct response was to forgive, was not a sudden burst of grace. It was the long-developed reflex of a people who'd been training themselves to respond this way for as long as there had been an Amish community at all. Looking forward, the Plain community in 2026 stands in a position that would have been almost unimaginable to the bishops of even 50 years ago. The population is growing rapidly, as we mentioned in the early chapters, with the total Amish population in North America now well past 400,000 and on track to exceed 1 million by the late 2050s. New settlements have been founded in places that no Amish community had previously reached, including northern Maine, central Montana, parts of Mississippi, and small footholds in remote corners of Wyoming. The expansion into upstate New York and rural Virginia is particularly notable, with land prices in these regions still low enough to allow young Amish families to establish farms without taking on the kind of debt that Lancaster County prices increasingly demand. The community is, in this sense, in a major demographic and geographic transition, spreading outward from the historic centres in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana into a much wider footprint across the eastern and central United States. The challenges this growth produces are real. Each new settlement has to establish its own church districts, train its own leadership, build its own schoolhouses, and develop its own relationships with the surrounding non-Plain communities. The internal diversity of the Plain world is also growing, as different settlements develop slightly different approaches to the same, recurring questions about technology, education, and economic life. The bishops who shaped Lancaster County a generation ago are passing on, and the next generation of bishops is facing a set of questions, particularly around digital technology and smartphone use among young people, that their predecessors did not have to confront in quite the same form. The smartphone, as we discussed earlier, remains the single most theologically challenging device the community has encountered in 3 centuries, and the question of how to manage its quiet spread among younger members has not been fully resolved in any Plain community. But the broader trajectory remains clear. The community is growing, the retention rates are holding, the basic structures we have walked through across this story, the ordnung, the bishops, the bench wagons, the buggy shops, the schoolhouses, the dialect, the dress code, the barn raisings, the Grostadi houses, the long, slow Sunday afternoons, are still doing the work they were designed to do. And in a wider American culture that often feels accelerated to the point of breakdown, that loses friends to overwhelm and burnout and the inability to keep up with itself, the Plain community offers something the surrounding society increasingly cannot match. They offer a place where things move slowly, where people know each other across generations, where work and faith and family form a single integrated whole, rather than 3 competing demands on a fractured life. Whether or not anyone else would choose to live this way, more and more people seem to be at least curious about what these communities have figured out. The tourists keep coming. The books keep getting written. The fascination keeps deepening. In the end, the story of the Plain community is not really a story about people who refused modernity. It is a story about people who, 300 years ago, made a particular decision about what kind of life they wanted to live, and who have, with extraordinary persistence and care, continued to make that decision every day since. The buggies, the bonnets, the unwritten codes, the long beards and the small white prayer coverings, the Sunday singings and the autumn weddings, all of these are not really the substance of Plain life. They are the visible surface. The substance is the community itself, the network of relationships, traditions, and shared commitments that holds these particular people together while so much of the surrounding world spins apart. The Plain people are, in this sense, a long, quiet experiment in what human community can be when it is built with care, maintained with patience, and chosen year after year by the people who live inside it. And so, as the lights dim and the day settles around you, perhaps this is a good moment to set the modern world aside for a few hours, to imagine, just for tonight, a place where the road slows to the speed of a horse, where the dinner table is full, where the neighbours are family, and where the 17th century is still going gently